The Vatican didn't fear what was carved into Petra's red stone because it was false, but because it was forbidden. Deep in those ancient canyons, hidden beyond sunlight and centuries, lies a gospel written not on parchment but etched in stone by hands the church chose to forget. They say the walls still speak if you know how to listen. Beneath its golden ceilings and sunlit chapels exists a second city, one without windows or clocks, and in that hidden world a whisper can echo for centuries. It was a quiet winter morning in the apostolic archives, the kind of morning when Rome's air feels heavy with stone and memory. The halls beneath the library were colder than usual, the light dimmer, the dust more restless. Father Luca, a man whose name most in the Vatican had already forgotten, walked softly across the marble floor. He'd worked here for 40 years, cataloguing forgotten letters and half-burned parchment. He was the kind of man who always wore gloves, not out of habit, but out of reverence. The words he handled weren't his, and he believed they still belonged to time. On this day, Luca wasn't looking for anything. He was simply filing documents from a collection labelled Missions to the East, 18th to 20th century. Most of the folders contained dull reports, shipments of wine, lists of converts, the occasional letter from a priest describing the desert wind. But then something caught his eye. A folder too thin to be indexed, misfiled behind a volume on Constantinople. It was sealed with red wax, cracked and brittle. Inside was a single sheet, not a report, but a letter. The paper was older than the others, water-stained, the ink faded but still visible, written in careful Latin. Luca read slowly. It spoke of a journey in the year 1923 made by a cardinal named Vittorio Leone. He'd travelled not to Jerusalem or Cairo but to a place that wasn't listed in any official mission. The letter only said, "I have seen the stone speak in Petra, and now I fear what it remembers." Petra. The name alone stirred something old in Luca's mind. He'd studied it in passing long ago during his days in seminary, a city carved into rose-red cliffs, Nabatean, pagan. But the letter didn't describe it as a ruin, it described it as alive. And beneath the cardinal's signature was a single line written in a shaking hand. "Do not let Rome forget, or it will return." Luca turned the page over. There was no second sheet, no date, no seal, just that one sentence echoing louder the longer he stared. That afternoon, Luca went to the master ledger to find more about Cardinal Leone. But there was no mention of him. No death recorded, no burial, as if he'd vanished into the sand. The whisper had found its way through, and now it waited to be heard in the stillness of the archive, with the dust hanging like breath in the cold light. Father Luca closed the folder and placed it gently on his desk. He didn't know it yet, but the silence he'd preserved for decades was about to speak. The old Vatican folder sat on Father Luca's desk like it had been waiting for decades. Its corners were softened by time, and the red wax seal had already crumbled when he found it. But something about the weight of the paper felt unusual, almost reluctant, like it didn't want to be touched again. Inside were 3 letters, not translations, originals, and not addressed to any pope or office. The first was written in Italian, in the narrow, flowing script of someone who'd studied both theology and fear. Luca adjusted his glasses and began to read. The letter was dated March of 1924, signed again by Cardinal Vittorio Leone. Until yesterday, Luca had never heard of him, and still no records existed, not in the Vatican directory, not in the burial registry, not even in the restricted ordinations list. It was as if the cardinal had never served or had been erased. But the letter was real. Cardinal Leone described an expedition he'd undertaken in the deserts east of Jerusalem. He hadn't gone alone. He travelled with a scholar, a Franciscan translator, and a man referred to only as the guide. Their goal was unclear, But the letter hinted at something hidden within the ancient city of Petra, something not recorded in scripture but spoken of in early Christian circles as the breath of the stone. The tone of the letter shifted midway through, turning urgent. He wrote of carvings found deep within the canyon, carvings not of pagan gods, but of a woman veiled in light, her arms raised as if speaking. Beneath the figure in weathered Greek was an inscription. She was not chosen. She was remembered. Luca paused. His heart beat louder than the silence. The second letter was shorter. It was addressed to the Secretary of the Holy Office, written from a makeshift camp just outside Petra. The handwriting had changed, less steady, more hurried. Cardinal Leone wrote of a discovery so dangerous that even the air felt heavy around it. He mentioned texts carved into the wall, texts that told a version of Christ's teachings, passed down not through Peter, but through a woman named Mariamne. And then came the third letter. It was never sent. The envelope was addressed to the Holy Father himself. Unsealed, the letter was only 3 lines. If this gospel is real, it is not heresy. It is origin. I await your instruction. I dare not leave. There was no signature, but at the bottom of the page was a smudge of blood and the faint imprint of a ring. Luca sat back in his chair. The lights above him flickered. Somewhere far overhead, the bells of St. Peter's rang the hour. But down here in the archives, time had stopped, and something buried long ago was stirring again. Father Luca had never been meant for the pulpit. Even as a young seminarian, he preferred dust to daylight, silence to sermons. While others prayed in the basilica, he studied old scrolls in the library. While others gave speeches, he listened for what had been forgotten. That was how the Vatican noticed him, not for what he said, but for how carefully he said nothing. In the year 1979, the Church offered him a post in the Apostolic Archive, the quiet heart of the Vatican's memory. It wasn't a promotion, and it came with no title, just a simple key and a single instruction. Protect what was written. Speak of nothing. You see, at the time, Luca hadn't asked questions. He'd been 29 years old, eager to serve and humbled to be trusted. That same year, he was brought into a private chamber below the library, a place only a handful had seen. A cardinal, one who wore no cross, only a plain ring of iron, stood beside a desk. On it lay a book. Luca was told to place his hand on the cover and repeat the archivist's oath. No one had prepared him for the words. The truth that cannot yet be told must not be lost. I will carry silence in one hand and memory in the other until the Church is ready. I will be the shadow of its voice. He'd never forgotten those words, not even once. For more than 4 decades, Luca kept his vow. He touched the edges of history without disturbing them. He copied letters by hand when copying machines weren't allowed. He cleaned cases holding documents signed by emperors and heretics alike. He saw signatures that had started wars, writings smuggled in from catacombs, condemned gospels bound in leather so old it cracked under breath. And he never told a soul. But now, seated alone in the flickering light of his office, with the unsigned letter from Cardinal Leone trembling in his hands, Father Luca felt something he hadn't felt in years. Doubt. The Church had trusted him to preserve secrets, not to interpret them. But this letter didn't feel like a relic. It felt like a message, sent forward through time, meant to be found, meant for him. He whispered the oath aloud again, testing the sound of it in the stillness. The walls didn't answer, but the silence seemed to lean in. Was keeping this hidden still an act of faith? Or had it become fear? As he returned the papers to the folder, he noticed something strange. A fine line of sand clung to the inside seam of the envelope, Petra's dust clinging where it had no right to be. Luca pressed it between his fingers. It smelled of sun, baked stone and something older than doctrine. For the first time in 40 years, he considered breaking the oath not to betray the Church, but to understand what it had buried. The Vatican's library didn't hum with activity. It breathed slowly, deeply, like a sleeping giant. Every scroll, every codex, every brittle piece of vellum sat not just as history, but as a memory waiting to be disturbed. Father Luca had spent much of his life in those shelves, and he'd long learned that some discoveries found him, not the other way around. He returned to the archives the morning after finding the forbidden letters, unable to ignore the quiet weight pressing on his thoughts. Petra, a forgotten cardinal, a gospel not written on paper but carved in stone, and now that thin trail of desert sand still clinging to the envelope. Something wanted to be seen. Luca chose not to go back to the sealed folder. Not yet. Instead, he followed instinct, letting his hands drift across spines worn by centuries. He moved to a shelf holding documents from the Middle Ages, many untouched since the days of parchment and candlelight. The volume he pulled down was heavy, wrapped in faded leather and cracked at the corners. It was a Latin concordance, nothing unusual. But when he opened the first few pages, his breath caught. The writing itself was standard, even dull, but scribbled faintly in the margins, barely visible beneath layers of ink, was a map. Not a detailed one, just a curved line to mark the SIQ, the narrow entrance to Petra, and a circle drawn around a part of the cliffs. Next to the circle, written in cramped Latin, was a single phrase, Vox Domini, the voice of the lady. He traced the lines with a trembling finger. The ink was older than the printed text, suggesting it had been added long before the book had even been bound. It had passed unnoticed for centuries, hidden in plain sight. Luca held the page closer to the light. Below the phrase was a symbol, a cross, but not a familiar one. It had 7 arms, curved like flame, radiating from a single point. He'd never seen anything like it. He rushed to the index at the back, flipping through pages for any reference to Petra, to the voice, to the strange cross. Nothing. The map wasn't part of the original document. It had been left by someone else long before the Vatican had ever classified this shelf. Then, as he examined the binding more closely, something small slipped from between the pages. A thin sheet of parchment folded twice. When he opened it, he saw a translation fragment in Greek. It read, and she said, "I was not the first to see him, but I was the only one who listened." Luca sat down slowly, heart racing with something between wonder and unease. This wasn't an ordinary marginal note. It was a trail. Someone had once tried to hide it inside a book no one would ever think to read. And now, decades or even centuries later, the message had landed in the hands of a Vatican archivist who'd taken an oath to protect the silence. But now, silence was no longer enough. The Vatican has never been just a place of worship. Beneath the domes and marble lies something deeper, a structure built not only of stone, but of silence. Some truths whispered through centuries aren't kept hidden out of malice, but because speaking them might tear the very walls apart. Father Luca knew this better than most. His work had taught him that what wasn't written down was often more dangerous than what was. Over the years, he'd seen references vanish from indexes, entire names blacked out from records with a stroke too precise to be accidental. But never had he found something so clearly erased as the next clue in his path. The map in the margins had led him back to a restricted ledger, minutes from Vatican councils held in the early 20th century. These meetings weren't part of any public record. They were labelled under vague titles such as Regional Doctrinal Review or Linguistic Clarification on Eastern Texts, harmless phrases meant to keep curious eyes away. But tucked inside one such volume dated November of 1923 was a single transcript that sent a chill through Luca's spine. The meeting was small, only 6 men present. Their names had been smudged beyond recognition, but the subject was clear. Petra must not be mentioned in ecclesial context. Moving forward, its theological implications are not only unverified, but threaten the apostolic foundation itself. The voice gospel, if it exists, cannot be accepted. It speaks of succession not by stone but by breath. This is unacceptable. Luca read the words again, slower this time. Succession, not by stone. The reference was unmistakable. The Church had long claimed that Peter the Rock was chosen by Christ as the foundation. The line of popes traced back to him. It was the pillar of authority, the cornerstone of order. But this mysterious gospel from Petra, it suggested another path. A voice, not a rock. A breath passed not through hierarchy, but through spirit. If that were true, it wouldn't just rewrite doctrine, it would unmake it. One of the council members had voiced concern. His name was left intact, perhaps by mistake. Bishop Antoine Seraphim, he'd warned. If we silence this now, it will one day return, not as a whisper, but as a cry. There were no further records of Bishop Seraphim after that date. No writings, no reassignment, no mention at all, just a quiet removal from every archive where his name had once appeared. Luca leaned back in his chair, the weight of the words pressing down on him. This wasn't just about history, it was about identity, of a church that feared its own shadow. And in that shadow, Petra waited. Unspoken, but not forgotten. Not anymore. There was a part of the Vatican that didn't appear on any tour map, no matter how detailed. It wasn't underground exactly, but beneath the known. A place where the walls were thicker, the locks older, and the air thinner. Archivists called it the lower vault, though most had never seen it. Those who had spoke of it in low voices, if they spoke of it at all. Father Luca had only been there once before, decades earlier, as part of his training. He hadn't been allowed to touch anything. He was told the room was for preservation, not study, and certainly not questions. But now, with the Petra, letters in his hands and the memory of Bishop Seraphim's warning echoing in his thoughts, Luca felt something shift. His duty to protect the church hadn't changed, but what he now felt deep in his chest, beneath his collar, was the sense that truth left in darkness too long begins to rot. It took him 3 keys and a signed pass from a cardinal who'd long since retired to reach the door. A long staircase curved downward into silence. The stones underfoot were smooth with age, but uneven, like they'd settled under the weight of secrets. The final door was thick iron, cold to the touch. No inscription, just a small circular slot for the key. Luca turned it slowly. The lock released with a groan, like something waking from sleep. Inside, the room felt smaller than he remembered. No windows, no lights beyond a single bulb that flickered weakly overhead. The walls were lined with sealed drawers, stacked from floor to ceiling, each marked with a number and no title. But one drawer was different. It wasn't numbered. It had a faint mark carved into the wood, a 7-lobed cross nearly invisible unless the light struck it just right. The same cross he'd seen in the margin of the Petra map. Luca opened it with care. Inside were brittle papers, parchment, and something wrapped in cloth. He unfolded it, a rubbing taken from a stone carving. The image was faint, but unmistakable. A crucifix, yes, but not the kind found in churches. The arms weren't outstretched, but folded as if in rest. The figure wore no crown, only a veil, and below it, in delicate script, bore the word, not in silence, but in breath. He felt the air leave his lungs. The room had no windows, but the temperature dropped. Or perhaps it only felt that way. This gospel, this carving, had been locked away with intention, not out of ignorance, but fear. And, in that quiet, sealed chamber, Father Luca understood something he hadn't dared to admit. The Vatican hadn't forgotten Petra. It had buried it carefully, deliberately, and now the breath it feared most had begun to rise again. Father Luca unrolled the cloth slowly, careful not to tear the brittle edge of the parchment tucked inside. The rubbing had clearly been taken by hand, pressed carefully against an ancient stone wall and blackened with soot or charcoal. Though the image had faded in parts, the lines remained strikingly clear, almost unnaturally so. The carving wasn't ornate, yet something about it refused to be ordinary. At first glance, it seemed simple. A crucifix, a lone figure with arms extended but not nailed. There was no crown of thorns, no agony in the posture. Instead, the body stood upright, calm, eyes closed, as if in deep breath. And then Luca saw the detail that made his throat tighten. The figure was veiled, not in the way a Roman widow might be, not in mourning. This veil was ceremonial, flowing like water, carved in stone. It wrapped around the shoulders. And below it, etched in the same steady hand, were symbols no church had ever authorized. A flame, a fish, and again that seven-lobed cross. He turned the rubbing toward the light. Beneath the symbols, in a line of Greek letters half worn away by time, the phrase emerged. She carried the word before the church had walls. Luca sat back. The meaning couldn't have been clearer. This carving hadn't been a piece of forgotten art or decorative stonework. It had been testimony, placed intentionally and hidden in plain sight. This wasn't simply early Christian iconography. It was something else, something older than canon, yet more confident in its voice. And someone, perhaps that vanished Cardinal Leone, or the unnamed scribe who'd risked making the rubbing, had believed it needed to survive. He checked the edge of the parchment again, a faint marking along the margin. Coordinates not printed, scratched in pencil. Hurriedly, he jotted them down. They pointed directly to Petra. Luca's heart pounded, not with fear, but recognition. Petra wasn't just a city of tombs and temples. It was a library written in rock. Every surface, every cliffside, every silent corridor might hold stories carved in silence, stories that had outlived fire, flood, and the careful erasure of history. And this particular story, buried so carefully in a Vatican drawer without a label, had waited until now to speak again. The twist wasn't that it had been hidden. The twist was that it had never been destroyed. The carving had survived, and if even one of these stones still stood in Petra, then so did the message. Not every gospel was written in ink. Some had been whispered to the stone, and the stone had remembered. The Vatican may have silenced voices for centuries, but it hadn't uncarved the truth. Not yet. And Father Luca, a man who'd spent his life in stillness, was now being called not to speak, but to listen. The envelope was sealed, but not with wax. It had been pressed shut, folded over twice, and bound by a single thread, now yellowed with age. It had no address, no stamp, just a small symbol drawn in the corner, a faint outline of a key no larger than a fingernail. Father Luca found it tucked inside the same drawer that held the rubbing from Petra. It was wedged behind a ledger, almost as if someone had meant to mail it, then changed their mind at the last moment. He untied the thread with care. Inside was a single sheet of thin, almost translucent parchment. The ink had faded, but the words remained steady. They'd been written in Latin, the kind used in formal Vatican correspondence. The writer had taken great care. No smudges, no hesitation. But the first line made Luca's hands go still. To whoever finds this letter, I beg you not to bring it into the light unless you are prepared to leave the church behind. He swallowed and kept reading. The letter had been written by a Jesuit priest, dated January of 1900. The name at the bottom, Father Armand Delacroix, was unfamiliar to Luca, but the location wasn't Petra. The letter described a discovery made deep within the rose-red cliffs. Father Delacroix had been tasked with examining carvings recently uncovered during a French expedition. The church hadn't sanctioned the visit. It had been quiet, unofficial, without the Vatican's name attached. At first, the letter described beauty, images of angels unlike any he'd seen, patterns that shimmered with sunlight, even in shadow. But then the tone shifted. He'd found a chamber hidden behind a collapsed wall containing carvings written in Greek and Syriac. But the language was strange, personal, not structured like scripture. It read like a voice. He wrote, "The one who speaks is a woman, not writing of him, but to him, as if she knew him before the church was born." The letter never referred to her by name, but again and again she called him my teacher and my breath. Father Delacroix admitted he'd begun to question what he'd been sent to find. He'd spent days in silence, unable to speak the Mass. He wrote, "I fear this voice more than any sword, for it speaks with certainty, not rebellion. The final lines were written in a shakier hand. I believe I have found the first witness. And if this is true, then everything we have placed upon Peter may have rested first on her shoulders. I do not know what to do. If I return with this truth, I fear I will not return at all." There was no signature, only a small, dark stain at the edge of the page. Father Luca folded the letter carefully, placing it back inside the envelope. He looked again at the drawer, at the rubbing, at the forgotten map. All these years these voices had waited, unmailed, unread, and unheard. But now someone was listening. There had always been rumours among the archivists, even among the ones who pretended not to believe. Whispers passed between rows of parchment and stone, spoken in Latin, under breath, or tucked inside footnotes no one was meant to read. The legend was always the same. Somewhere in the folds of time there had once existed a gospel, but not one of the four. A fifth, unwritten on scrolls, uncopied by scribes, hidden instead in stone. Father Luca had heard these stories years ago, late at night over coffee with a senior librarian who'd since passed away. At the time, it had sounded like one of the many Vatican mysteries left to legend. Just enough truth to make the silence feel sacred. But now the weight of evidence on his desk made those old whispers louder. He opened an older codex retrieved from the same drawer that had held the Petra rubbing. It was a field report, marked confidential and signed by a Monsignor who died in the year 1927. In the margins, the scribe had scribbled something strange, notes not about what the expedition had found, but what they hadn't been allowed to mention in their final report. The cave holds her words, the stone speaks with her voice. We are not the first to read it. We are only the first to return, afraid. Beneath the writing was a sketch of the Petra landscape. Not the famous treasury or the great tombs, but a narrow passage deep within the cliffs marked with three symbols: a fish, a flame, and a broken circle. And again the same phrase appeared, the voice gospel. Luca leaned closer. The gospel, according to all sources, had no official name, not in any church record. Yet here it was, whispered again and again, like a word too heavy to be written in full. The story went further than heresy. It hinted that this gospel had been composed not after Christ's death, but during his life, by someone who'd walked beside him. And not Peter, not Paul, not any of the names carved in cathedrals, but a woman. The letter from Petra, the sealed drawer, the carving of the veiled figure, the phrase she bore the word not in silence but in breath. All of it pointed to her. Someone who hadn't just followed him, but recorded him, remembered him in a voice that didn't echo the apostles, but stood apart from them, a witness, a writer, a disciple with a gospel of her own. Luca closed the codex and stared at the candle flickering on his desk. If the whispers were true, then what was buried in Petra wasn't just a missing gospel. It was the first one, and the Vatican had been fearing its return ever since the stone first learned to speak. It was the spring of 1962, and St. Peter's Square was filled with sunlight and silence. Tens of thousands had gathered to hear the Holy Father speak, a homily long anticipated, prepared with great care. It was to be a message of unity and tradition, offered just months before the opening of the Second Vatican Council. But within the papal apartments, behind closed doors and thick curtains, something unusual had happened. The speech had changed. Father Luca had read the official version of the homily many times before. It was simple, reassuring, filled with phrases about apostolic faith, the strength of Peter's legacy, the call to holiness. But recently, buried deep in a drawer beneath the archives, marked orationes non dictate, speeches never given, he'd found a draft, a different one. It was written in the same elegant Latin used for papal writings, but the phrasing was unfamiliar, poetic, almost intimate. The opening line wasn't about Peter, but about a voice heard in the wilderness. Not John the Baptist, but a voice of a woman who once stood where the rock would be laid. Luca read it twice. The reference was subtle, almost careful, but as he read further, the words became bolder. Before Peter stood firm, there was another who listened in silence, and she, though unnamed in our altars, bore the word not in proclamation but in presence. We do not yet know how to speak of her, but we must no longer pretend we do not hear her. The page ended there. A red line had been drawn through the paragraph. The next page returned to the familiar language of doctrine and obedience. The poetic voice was gone, but the paper bore more than ink. In the margin, someone had written a single word in Petra. Luca closed the folder and sat back. The Pope who'd written this had come close to saying something the Church had never allowed to be said from the pulpit. He'd come close to acknowledging not a new doctrine but an older memory, one that tied the legacy of Christ not only to Peter and the apostles but to a forgotten witness. Perhaps the same woman described in the carvings of Petra, the same voice spoken of in the hidden gospel. And, for one brief moment, her name had almost been carried on the wind across St. Peter's Square. Almost. What had stopped him? Pressure from the Curia? A quiet warning from the Holy Office? Or something else? Something even older? Luca couldn't say, but he knew now that silence, even in the Church, was rarely an accident. The Pope had almost spoken, and in choosing not to, he'd left behind a crack, a small one. But through that crack, the breath of something long buried had begun to rise again, and it was Luca now who would have to decide whether to speak where a pope had once stayed silent. The last time Father Luca walked through the gates of the Vatican, no one noticed. There was no farewell, no procession, not even a nod from the Swiss guard. Just the soft echo of his shoes on the stone as he moved through the outer corridor of the archive, carrying nothing but a plain satchel and a folded letter in his coat. He'd written his resignation by hand that morning. No explanation, no argument. Just a short sentence and his name signed in ink that hadn't yet dried when he placed it on the cardinal's desk. It would be found in a few hours, perhaps less. But by then he would already be gone. Luca hadn't slept the night before. His thoughts had been tangled with the voices of the past, whispers from Petra, warnings from lost priests, and the veiled figure carved in stone. Each message had felt quiet at first, but now together they'd become something louder. Not a sound exactly, but a pull. He didn't leave through the main gate. There was a small side door used by archivists, one that opened into the narrow streets behind the Vatican museums. It was rarely locked. He passed through it before sunrise, the city still dim with early fog. No one followed him, but he had the strange sense that someone had already noticed he was gone. He boarded a train south without speaking, then a second headed east. When he reached the airport, he presented a Vatican-issued diplomatic passport, the kind few ever held. It raised no questions. The destination read, Amman, Jordan. On the flight, Luca sat by the window, not reading, not writing, just thinking. He remembered a conversation from years ago spoken by a Jesuit who trained him in the early days of his work. The man had said, "The greatest danger is not the lie. It is the truth that was buried so deep even the faithful forgot it." Luca now understood what he'd meant. He wasn't chasing myth. He was following a thread woven through letters, rubbings, carvings, and nearly erased speeches, and all of it pointed back to Petra, the red city, the carved stone, the voice not written but spoken into silence. When the plane touched down in Jordan, the air was warmer than he expected, dry, with a faint trace of desert wind. He stepped off the stairwell without luggage, his eyes scanning the distant hills. Somewhere beyond them, buried beneath centuries of sand and secrecy, was the truth the Vatican had once feared enough to silence. And now, for the first time in his life, Father Luca no longer carried silence in both hands. In one hand he now carried a question, in the other the courage to answer it. The road to Wadi Musa curved like a ribbon through the desert, winding between hills of sand the colour of rust and ash. Father Luca sat in the back of a dusty taxi, his satchel resting on his knees, the hum of the engine steady beneath him. Outside the window, the light changed with every turn. First gold, then pale, then deep red. It wasn't just a landscape. It was a memory written in stone. The driver spoke little, an older man with weathered hands and eyes that looked like they'd seen too many seasons pass. When they finally approached the edge of the village, he pointed to the hills and said softly, "She is waiting there." Luca looked up, unsure what the man meant. But before he could ask, the driver turned his eyes back to the road and said nothing more. Wadi Musa looked small from a distance, but it unfolded as they entered narrow streets, sandstone walls, shops tucked into corners, and children playing near faded steps. It was quiet, like a town that had learned how to keep secrets. Luca checked into a modest guest house on the edge of town. It was simple. Bare walls, a single window, a wooden table with a chipped glass of water beside the bed. But it was enough. The real purpose of his journey lay just beyond the village, hidden inside the ancient cliffs of Petra. He stood by the window for a long time that evening, watching the sun sink behind the hills. The shadows grew longer and the shapes of the cliffs seemed to shift, as if something just beneath the surface was waiting to be seen. There was a moment, just before darkness, when the desert turned a deep shade of crimson. Luca had read about it in old travel accounts, the hour the rocks remember. It was then that he saw a small flicker of movement in the far hills. Not a person, not an animal, just a shimmer, like breath-escaping stone. That night, Luca didn't sleep. Instead, he opened his satchel and laid the pieces out on the table. The rubbing from the Petra carving, the forgotten map drawn in the margins of the codex, the unsent letter from the Jesuit priest, and the copy of the draft homily, the one the Pope had nearly spoken aloud. All the voices pointed to this place, and now he was here. But what surprised him most wasn't the weight of the mystery, or the fear of what he might find. It was something else, a strange calm, as if part of him had always known he would return to this place. Not to uncover something new, but to remember something the Church had once chosen to forget. And in the stillness of Wadi Musa, the silence no longer felt empty. It felt like breath being held. Father Luca stepped carefully along the narrow trail that led out from the heart of Petra and into the cliffs beyond the public paths. The morning sun cast long shadows between the towering stone walls, and every step seemed to echo with memory. He walked alone, guided only by a faint set of markings left on the edge of his old map. markings that didn't appear on any tourist guide or official registry. The locals in Wadi Musa had warned him. They said the path led nowhere. Others said it ended at a ruined cistern or a collapsed tomb, but Luca knew better. He'd spent too many years in silence, too many nights reading between the lines of forbidden texts, to dismiss what those small marks meant. The cliffs grew steeper, the air thinner, and then, without warning, the canyon widened. There, half buried in the rock face, stood a structure no one had mentioned. A monastery, but not the famous one known to travellers. This was different, smaller, older, almost erased by time. Its shape was strange, carved directly into the stone, like so many other tombs in Petra. But the symbols etched above the doorway weren't Nabatean. They were Christian. And they were early. Too early. A simple cross stood at the centre of the archway. Not the Latin cross, but one shaped like a star with arms equal in length. Around it, 7 small flames had been carved in a circle. Luca recognised the pattern from the rubbing he'd found in the Vatican archive. This was no ordinary monastic dwelling. It had been hidden, not by accident, but by design. He stepped through the entrance, careful not to disturb the stone underfoot. The interior was dark, but his eyes adjusted quickly. Rows of small alcoves lined the walls, and there, just ahead, a faded fresco clung to the far surface. It showed a woman, not a saint in the usual sense. No halo, no crown, just a figure in white, hands raised, not in prayer but as if she were speaking. Beside her stood a small group of men listening, not teaching her, listening to her. The script below was nearly lost to age, but a single word remained. Mariamne. Luca felt the weight of the name settle in his chest. Not Mary, not the Virgin, but Mariamne, the ancient form used in certain early texts to refer to Mary Magdalene. He'd read about her in the apocryphal Gospels. She was called the companion, the witness, sometimes the teacher, but never in official church doctrine. Yet here she was, painted in silence, hidden in a monastery no one remembered. And if she'd been carved in this place, surrounded by Christian symbols centuries older than they should be, then the church hadn't been the first to tell her story. It had only been the first to bury it. The light inside the monastery shifted with the hours, tracing the walls like fingers across old skin. Father Luca remained still, seated on a flat stone beneath the faded fresco of Mariamne. He'd spent the last hour studying the space, letting his eyes adjust, waiting for the walls to speak. And then he saw it. To the right of the fresco, behind a fallen slab of sandstone, part of the wall caught the sunlight in a strange way. Not with a shimmer, but with something more deliberate. An unevenness. A shape almost smoothed into the rock. He knelt beside it and brushed the dust away with the edge of his sleeve. There it was again. The cross, but not the one worn around his neck, and not the one carved above altars across Europe. This cross had 7 arms, not 4, each curved like a flame spreading from a central point in a pattern that felt more alive than symbolic. It didn't resemble anything in the church's official iconography. It was older, wilder, and yet undeniably intentional. He'd seen this symbol before, on the parchment rubbing hidden in the Vatican vault, and again in the margin of the medieval codex. But this was different. This wasn't drawn. It was carved, and below it, in small lettering, a phrase barely legible through time. The light he gave she bore in 7. Luca exhaled slowly. He traced the arms of the cross with his finger, counting aloud in a whisper. 7. Not the number of apostles, not the number of churches or cardinal sins, but something else. He'd only ever seen 7 lights mentioned in Revelation, connected to the 7 spirits before the throne. But here, the cross was connected not to judgment, but to her, to the woman in the fresco, to Mariamne. It wasn't a symbol of power. It was a sign of transmission, as if what she'd received had been divided, carried and passed forward, not through a single man, but through 7 living flames. Luca stood and stepped back. If this cross was authentic and there was no sign of forgery, then it changed more than just art history. It altered the shape of the church's foundation. For centuries, tradition had taught that Peter held the keys, that through him the church received the light. But this carving told a different story, one where the light wasn't locked away but carried by her. And if this was true, if Mariamne had once stood at the centre of a forgotten tradition, then the Vatican hadn't only silenced her memory, it had erased her role. And yet, here in Petra, the stone had refused to forget. Father Luca followed the curve of the wall deeper into the ruined monastery, where the air turned cooler and the silence grew heavier. This part of the structure had collapsed in places, with sunlight slipping through cracks high above. Dust hung in the beams of light like suspended breath. The smell of dry stone and something older, maybe old parchment or decayed fabric, lingered in the corners. His fingers traced the walls as he walked, searching not for relics but for patterns. The monastery wasn't grand, but it was deliberate. Every carved line had a purpose. Every symbol was placed not for beauty, but to be read, like a scripture made of stone. Then he saw her. Set into a recess of the far wall, half hidden behind a broken pillar, was a relief. It was smaller than the fresco of Mariamne, but far more detailed. A woman stood at the centre, carved in soft curves and long robes, her arms raised at her sides, not upward in prayer, but outward, palms open. Her head was bowed slightly, and her eyes were closed, not peacefully, not in sleep, but as if listening. There was no crown, no halo, no divine markings, and yet her presence felt powerful still, as if the moment captured in the carving had never ended. Below her feet, a short line of Greek was etched into the base. Father Luca read it aloud. She did not see with her eyes, but with the breath between the silence. He stepped back slowly. This wasn't an image of authority. It wasn't meant to inspire fear or command. It was reverence of another kind, the kind that listens instead of speaks. And her posture, arms open, not reaching, seemed to invite something or someone in. The longer he looked, the more the silence in the room felt alive. The carving was different from anything he'd studied. Early Christian art usually portrayed figures in dramatic acts, martyrdom, healing, preaching, but this was stillness made holy, and the figure's face held no agony, no ecstasy, only calm, as if she'd heard something others couldn't. Luca sat on the cold stone floor, facing the carving. In that moment, a thought came to him, unbidden and unwelcome. What if the truest gospel had never been spoken aloud? What if it had only been breathed, carried in silence from witness to witness, carved in places the church couldn't reach? That would explain why she was always left out, why her name was whispered, not declared, and why the Vatican had locked away every trace of her that had ever surfaced. Because if her witness was not only real but older, older than the epistles, older than the councils, then the foundation of everything would tremble. And still she stood there, eyes closed, waiting. Father Luca climbed slowly, the path narrowing as it wound upward along the cliffs above Petra. The rocks grew redder with altitude, as though the mountain itself had been soaked in memory. There were no signs, no markers, only a faded goat trail and the sound of wind pulling through stone arches high above. The people in Wadi Musa had spoken of him in half smiles and muttered warnings. The one who watches from the heights. A hermit, they said, who lived above the ruins and refused to leave. Some believed he was a Bedouin healer, others a madman touched by visions. But the older ones said he guarded something. Luca hadn't come to judge. He'd come to listen. Near the top of the ridge, the trail flattened into a small plateau. A single tree clung to life near the edge, its roots wrapping around ancient rock. Beside it, a narrow stone shelter leaned into the mountainside patched with mud and wood. The door stood open. A man sat just inside, wrapped in linen the colour of the cliffs. His beard was white and long, and his eyes were darker than the desert sky. He didn't move when Luca approached. "You have climbed far," the man said in perfect Italian. Luca blinked. "You speak my language." The hermit smiled only slightly. "I speak the one needed when the time is right." Luca hesitated at the edge of the shelter. The man gestured for him to sit. "My name is Luca. I know who you are," the hermit said softly, "and I know why you are here." Luca felt a chill, though the air was warm. "Then you know about the monastery, the carvings." The hermit nodded. "They are not the beginning, only the edge." He reached into a worn leather satchel and drew out a small object wrapped in cloth. Inside was a flat stone, no larger than a hand. On it, the same seven-lobed cross. Beneath it, a word carved in Syriac. Ruha. Luca whispered the meaning. Breath. The hermit looked at him. She spoke it into the stone so it wouldn't be forgotten. The church turned it into silence. But stone doesn't forget. Luca held the stone carefully. It felt warm, as if it had been waiting to be touched. "You believe she wrote a gospel?" "I believe she remembered what others only heard." The hermit stood and walked to the edge of the plateau, looking down toward the city carved into the valley below. They came before he said, "Men from the west, scholars, priests." They wanted to translate, to collect, but they left afraid. Luca stepped beside him. "Afraid of what?" "Not of what they found," the hermit said. "Afraid of what it made them question." The wind moved through the rocks, and the valley whispered back a voice, not loud but steady, and Father Luca knew deep in his chest that the real journey was only just beginning. Father Luca followed the hermit's directions along a narrow ridge, barely wider than his own feet. The path sloped downward into a hidden ravine where the cliffs leaned in so close they blocked the sun. Time here moved slower. Even the wind seemed to pause before entering. The trail ended at a smooth rock wall, unmarked and silent. Luca hesitated. There was no door, no arch, no sign that it was anything more than stone. But then he saw it, just beneath the curve of the rock. A thin slit, no wider than a man's shoulders. A break made not by the land, but by purpose. He moved into it. The moment he was inside, the atmosphere shifted. It felt denser, like the cavern itself had inhaled and held its breath. A fine film of powder drifted in the beam of his lamp, untouched by wind, settling slowly from the rock face like fine ash. It coated his boots with every step, deep and silky, the shade of old dried blood. He went further into the chamber, and then he realized something. The dust wasn't only on the floor, it was spilling from the stone itself, a sluggish, quiet flow from fissures along the surfaces. It appeared the cave was shedding something, not a fluid, but a memory. He dropped to his knees and felt the residue. It crumbled effortlessly, finer than sand. Underneath, the stone showed faint markings, writing, engravings hidden by the passage of time. He cleared a larger section, and once more saw the Syriac inscription, the identical antique script as before. "Say only what is true." The sentence ran down the wall, fading with each repetition, as if the person writing it had lost strength or light. The script became harder to discern, absorbed by the powder. Luca ignited a new wick and continued deeper. At the farthest edge of the cavity, the space broadened into a small recess, circular and soundless. The walls curved inward, forming a space that felt more like a source of life than a room, and on the back wall, sketched with the same delicate hand, was a shape. This time, it was a woman. Her palms were open, facing up. Her eyes were closed. Surrounding her, the 7 flames were etched once more, drawn with careful balance. And above her, written in Greek, the words he'd spoken. But she remained, and in stillness she remembered. The hollow wasn't a grave. It was a witness, a vessel designed not to conceal something, but to keep it safe. And the dust that seeped from the rock wasn't rot. It was the past, pulling itself away from the silence. Luca stood still for a long while, listening not for sounds, but for what the air was attempting to convey. And in that quiet, he finally understood. This was more than history. It was a statement, and the cave, quietly shedding its past into the world, was ready for someone to recall it again. Father Luca knelt before the carved surface, his light casting gentle gold-toned shapes against the chamber's reddish stone. The closer he looked, the more he saw the writing wasn't restricted to the central carving. It flowed across the walls in looping lines, wrapping the room like a thread of forgotten breath. At a quick glance, the text seemed to be Aramaic. But as he brought the light closer, he saw an odd detail. The curves were longer than usual, the angles softer and scattered throughout. Small Greek characters appeared, inserted between the words, like secret steps. It was a blend, 2 tongues intertwined like strands of the same fabric, not translated, but written as one, as though the author hadn't chosen a tongue, but forged her own. Luca's heart quickened. He'd spent years studying ancient writings, but this was unique. This wasn't the work of someone duplicating what they'd been told. This was the sound of someone who had lived the memory herself. The stone wasn't flat. Tiny ridges tracked the script, as if the letters had been carved using heat, not a blade. Luca lifted his lamp higher and caught the slight sheen on the walls. The surface reflected the light like hardened glass. He reached into his coat and pulled out a magnifying aid. With it, he saw the truth. The letters hadn't been cut. They had been burned. Each stroke had liquefied into the stone in fine grooves, leaving a texture that was rough to the touch, but seamless to the eye. He gently pressed his fingers to the surface. It was cool now, but a long time ago it had known flame. The room had not just been written in, it had been moulded somewhere in the folds of memory. Luca recalled a passage from a forbidden Jesuit record he had once decoded in secret. It spoke of a lost chronicle, written not on rolls or skin, but in the language of fire and earth. He had thought it poetry, now he realised it was instruction, a narrative unlike any other, not meant to be carried in bags or read by a candle, but etched in the very skeleton of the planet, guarded from ruin, preserved by warmth. And the phrases themselves, even without complete decoding, held a rhythm. She walked not behind him, but alongside. She held no role but the flame. When he went silent, she remembered. Father. Luca sat back on the cold floor, overcome. This wasn't a myth, not a shadow of a chronicle. This was the voice itself, living in the stone, unfaded by time. And for the first time since leaving the Vatican, he felt something he hadn't anticipated. Not fear, wonder. Because if this chamber had truly been inscribed by fire, then the Church had never truly controlled the first chronicle. It had only controlled who was permitted to hear it. The opening line of the carved chronicle did not begin with a name or a date or a claim of truth. It began with a voice, and she said, "To them he is not here. For the Spirit moves forward. Father." Luca whispered the phrases aloud, following them with his gaze as they seemed to glow in the dancing lamplight. The language felt antique, but the message was immediate, pulsing with something deeper than regulation. There was no mention of Peter, no mention of Rome. Only the speaker, a woman and her voice. He moved gradually along the curving chamber wall, tracking the writing as it spiraled inward like a root, not just through stone, but through time. Each section expanded on the last, not with mandates, but with recollection. It read like someone remembering out loud, not teaching, not convincing, just relating the story she had held within herself. She spoke of walking next to him, not following, of seeing him weep under a fig tree before the execution, of a quiet in the garden that had lasted longer than any speech. She spoke of watching him after the tomb was found empty, not as a ghost in the sky, but as a light advancing into the desert air, without words, without a fixed goal, as if inviting the world to follow, without knowing the route ahead. Luca's chest tightened. He had never encountered a chronicle like this. There were no rules here, no promises of reward, no threats of eternal punishment. Only one instruction: trace the breath and recall what the voice has shown you. He had read every chronicle the Vatican had saved, and many it had hidden. But this one, this chronicle of the voice, it offered no power, only presence. The power was not in the marvels. It was in the simple act of witnessing, and the voice belonged to her, Mariamne. Not identified as Mary Magdalene, not labelled as wrongdoer or saint, but simply as the one who stayed, the one who listened, the one who did not turn away. Luca felt something awaken in him, a quiet sadness. Not for what was lost, but for what had been obscured. All those ages of teachings and assemblies, announcements and silences had tried to relate only one version of the story, one route, one voice. But here, concealed in reddish stone, the quiet had been shattered. Not in thunder, not in fire, but in a whisper, and that whisper had survived everything. He reached the final phrases of the visible section. His voice shook as he read them aloud. The light is not found, it is followed. And the voice that calls you will not be above, but alongside. Luca knelt before the wall, his head bent, not in worship, but in comprehension. This was the chronicle the Church had dreaded. Not because it was false, but because it couldn't be controlled. Father Luca's fingers shook slightly as he redirected the light toward the lower boundary of the wall. The letters here were smaller, tighter, pressed like a final breath into the deepest grain of the stone. This was not an open announcement. It was a signature, written not to declare dominance, but to leave behind a trace. There, beneath the last curve of the etched spiral, was a single I, Mariamne, who was called She of the Voice. The scribe had not been a man, not a bishop, not a cleric, not one of the educated theologians that filled the Vatican's marble halls. It had been her, the same woman shown in the engravings, standing with open hands and closed eyes. The same name murmured in the edges of unofficial writings. Always doubted, always dismissed. She had written it not about him, but about what she had witnessed, what she had heard, what she had remembered when others had fled. Luca took a step back, steadying himself. A wave of quiet certainty washed over him, the kind that felt sacred and risky all at once. The Vatican had long taught that divine text was handed down through a hallowed line, guarded by men chosen by divine permission. Every chronicle, every message, every lesson had been filtered through that perspective. But this chronicle was different. It had not passed through councils. It had not been debated or altered by copyists in lit monasteries. It had been carved into the ground by the hand of one woman who claimed no position, only memory. And her memory had lasted. Luca stared at the name Mariamne in his studies, and he had seen it only a few times, always buried deep in prohibited texts, the kind the Church kept locked behind massive doors. Some scholars thought it was an early name for Mary Magdalene. Others argued it referred to a different follower entirely, a woman silenced by early church leaders who feared the power of her testimony. But now, in this cave, there was no question. She had inscribed her truth, and the stone had preserved it. Luca reached again into his bag, pulled out his worn notebook, and began to copy the name, slowly, meticulously, as if each letter needed to be recalled by his own hand. He could not risk forgetting it. Not now. The chronicle had not only revealed new phrases, it had revealed its writer. A woman speaking not with power, but with presence. A voice that had gone unheard not because it was faint, but because it had been suppressed. And yet here it was, engraved in fire, protected in dust, waiting not for approval, but for someone willing to listen. Father Luca whispered her name one more time, as if it might unlock something still concealed beneath the centuries. Mariamne. And in that moment, the cave did not feel empty. It felt full of life. The sun had already started to set when Father Luca emerged from the cave, his clothing clinging to him with dust and moisture. He held his notebook close, heart pounding not from the ascent but from what he had just read, what he had seen etched into the walls. The name, the voice, the truth. He needed answers, not from volumes, not from the Vatican's polished rooms, but from someone who recalled the place, the stories, and the people who came before him. So that night he went back to the hermit of the high place. The old man was seated outside his shelter, legs crossed, heating water over a gentle flame. He did not look up when Luca approached. "You have seen her?" the hermit said. Luca sat down opposite him. "Yes," he whispered. The hermit nodded slowly. "Then you are not the first." Luca leaned forward. "Others have found the chamber." "Not many," the man said, "but enough." He poured the hot water into 2 small clay vessels, handing one to Luca. "They came a long time ago. Scholars, clergy. 2 of them wore vestments like yours. One French, I think, the other older, with a mark on his hand." Luca knew the name before the hermit said it. "Jesuits." The hermit nodded. "They found scrolls, loose fragments hidden behind a concealed barrier, some in Greek, others in Aramaic, not carved like the chamber, but written by hand, carefully, lovingly." Luca's breath hitched. "What became of them?" "They took them," the hermit said. "Told no one? Promised to return." "Did they?" The hermit shook his head. "One perished in the desert, fell from the high precipices. Locals found his body days later, his bag ripped open, papers scattered to the wind. The other he vanished. Some say he was taken." "Taken by the same silence that guards her voice," the hermit said calmly. Luca drank from his cup, his hands trembling. Were the scrolls copied? Saved? "They were translated," the hermit said, "but not shared. The copies, like the originals, disappeared. The man who translated them sent one final message, nothing more than a single line. He took a small folded note from a pouch beneath his robes, the edges brittle and yellow. He handed it to Luca. The note read, "She was the first to speak, and they feared the sound of her memory. That was all." Luca closed his eyes. The church had always been adept at shaping the account, deciding which voices to amplify and which to conceal. But scrolls could not disappear by themselves. Someone had made them vanish, perhaps not to eliminate the truth, but to postpone it, to purchase time, to cling to power just a little longer. But Petra had waited longer than any Vatican wall, and Mariamne's voice, once etched in fire and carried in scrolls, had not been lost. It had only been waiting for someone brave enough to listen. And now that someone had arrived. Father Luca sat alone by the small fire that night, the stars above like punctures in dark velvet, the stones around him still warm from the day's heat. The hermit had become silent again, retreating into his small stone dwelling, as if the recollection of the lost scrolls had awakened too much of something ancient. Luca turned over the note in his hand one last time before slipping it into the folds of his journal. He could not stop thinking about the Jesuits. The hermit had spoken of men who had come before him, wearing collars like his own, carrying questions the Vatican never wanted asked. The next morning the hermit guided him beyond the cliffs, past the ruined monastery to a narrow gorge where the sand drifted in slow waves like water. "He was discovered here," the hermit said, pointing to a slope half covered in stone. "The priest with the scar." Luca stepped cautiously into the basin. The air smelled of metallic copper and time. He knelt down, brushing aside a pile of loose earth with his hand, uncovering something dark beneath a leather-bound journal, its binding cracked but whole. He stared at it motionless. Then he opened the first page. The writing was small, tidy, and clearly clerical. The name at the top made Luca's chest tighten. Father Emilio Varela, Society of Jesus. The date was written just below 1903, over 100 years prior. Luca turned the pages slowly. Father Emilio had kept meticulous notes, sections from the scrolls, fragments translated phrase by phrase, along with diagrams of symbols cross-referenced with unofficial texts and early Syrian hymns. One entry stood out, marked with a small smudge of red pigment. Her name is not a fable. She walked alongside him, not behind. She bore the word like fire, and the fire was not put out. The scroll speaks of breath as the sign of the living chronicle, not paper. This voice, her voice, removes the need for succession. Luca read it again. Removes the need for succession. It was a sentence that would shatter the church if ever spoken aloud in the wrong place. He flipped further. The final entries were rushed. One read only, "They know the message I sent to Rome was never answered. I am being observed. I have concealed a copy of the translation beneath the altar rock at the monastery. If I do not return, burn this." But it had never been burned. Luca looked up at the hermit, who stood still, watching the desert like it might change form at any moment. "Did you know this was here?" Luca asked. "I buried it again after they left," the hermit said, "but it was never meant for me to keep." The sand shifted behind them, the wind picking up. With a low whistle, Father Luca closed the journal, holding it like a delicate artifact. The truth had not disappeared. It had been waiting in the dust, one page at a time, and now the voice of a long-dead Jesuit had joined Mariamne's whisper, not to silence her, but to move her forward. The old journal trembled slightly in Father Luca's hands as he turned the page. Each line he read seemed to alter something in his mind, like dust stirring where sunlight had never been. The Chronicle of Mariamne, translated by a long-dead Jesuit, was not only different in tone, it was different in aim. It did not speak to authority, it spoke to presence. In one part, the voice of Mariamne recalled a moment not found in any other chronicle. He touched no seat of power, crowned no chief, built no throne. He bent to the ground and wrote with his finger, then turned and asked who had grasped the meaning, not who had obeyed. Luca paused. There were no mentions to Peter as the foundation, no mention of keys or authority passed from one man to another. Instead, this chronicle taught that the real path was not to lead, but to walk, beside, to listen, to recall, and perhaps most troubling of all, to the church to choose without needing approval. Further, in the text, Mariamne described what she called the breath of understanding. It was not cleansing through water. It was not ceremony. It was the moment when one realized they did not require a priest to reach the divine, that the sacred had already made its dwelling within. When I asked if I should follow Peter, she wrote, he smiled and said, "Why do you ask for a light when the sun is already on your face?" Luca felt the weight of that phrase settle deep in his chest. For ages, the Vatican had protected the belief in apostolic lineage, that Christ passed power to Peter and Peter to the bishops, and through them the sacred structure had flowed. The clergy was the channel, the framework, the custodian of grace. But here, in stone and memory, was a voice that whispered something else. What if grace had never required a gatekeeper? What if faith had been unrestricted all along? No wonder the Vatican had concealed this. No wonder scrolls vanished and letters were silenced. If this chronicle became known, the very foundation of the church would be shaken. It would mean that the people had been instructed to wait at the entrance when the entrance had never been barred. Luca turned the page again and saw a section circled in red ink. By Father Emilio. He said to me, "Your memory will outlast their pronouncements. Tell them not to build, but to remember. Not to govern, but to breathe. Breathe that word again." Luca sat back, closing his eyes. He could feel the desert air slipping into the chamber through the narrow opening. Gentle, steady, like breath. This was not just a different chronicle. It was a different way of perceiving the sacred. And the church had been afraid of it. Not because it was incorrect, but because it was unbound. By the time the moon had climbed high over Petra's cliffs, Father Luca had found his way back to the chamber alone. He needed quiet, not the Vatican's refined stillness, but the kind of quiet that came from the earth itself. A quiet that listened in return. He brought only his lamp, his journal, and a small brush to remove the layers of dust still clinging to the walls. But when he stepped inside, he noticed something he had overlooked before. The engravings were different, not in form, but in illumination. By day the chronicle seemed etched in faint, stable lines. But now, in the moon's silver-blue glow streaming through the narrow opening above the chamber, something shifted. The phrases seemed to shimmer, not brightly, but with a living softness like embers long after the fire. Luca held up his lamp and moved slowly. Where the light touched directly, the stone was peaceful, but where moonlight passed across it, even dimly, patterns appeared beneath the carvings. Layered script, faint markings, shapes that had been unseen before. He stepped back, surprised. One wall that had appeared empty now showed a faded outline, a figure, not carved, but seared into the surface in the slightest contrast, like breath on glass. It was Mariamne again, but in this form she was sitting, one hand held to her chest, the other extended outward, not to give, not to take, but simply to open. Her lips were slightly parted, as though she were still speaking. Luca turned toward another wall and saw similar marks, lines beneath lines, a second language beneath the first, one that could only be seen under the correct light. He remembered a method he had read about once, buried in an old Jesuit commentary. Desert fire writing, an ancient technique used by travelling scribes, words etched not just with tools, but with flame and metal treated with local elements that reacted to moonlight or starlight. It was used when a message needed to stay hidden until the night revealed it. The engravings in this chamber were not only meant to be read, they were meant to be awakened. Luca placed his hand flat against the wall. The stone was cool, but as he stood in stillness, it began to throb. Not physically, but rhythmically. The feeling was subtle, like standing next to someone breathing in their sleep. The chamber was alive, not in the way people spoke of haunted places or ghosts, but in the way memory persists. Quiet, steady, refusing to vanish. He whispered softly, "You wrote this to endure." The Vatican had taught him that truth was written in books, locked in strong rooms, protected by chains of translation and sanction. But here, in the reddish stone of Petra, truth had been left to the wind and the moon carved, not to be claimed, but to be discovered. And it was not afraid to breathe not any more. In the faint quiet of his small rented room in Wadi Musa, Father Luca unfolded the last delicate page from Father Emilio's journal. The handwriting had become shaky, the ink light, but the phrases carried weight, as though even the pen had struggled with their meaning. It spoke of a Vatican assembly held in secret, not one of the grand councils taught in schools or rumoured about in church history. No, this was a concealed meeting in the spring of 1923. A gathering not of hundreds, but a dozen men cloaked in the quiet of old marble rooms beneath the apostolic palace. They met after the first account from Petra. A dispatch arrived in Rome. Father Emilio had sent duplicates of his early translations, along with diagrams of the seven-lobed cross and a summary of the chronicle's most unsettling sections. He believed the church would be interested, curious even. Instead, they were worried. According to the journal, the reply came not in a letter, but in a summons. He was called back to Rome. The assembly was convened within a week. They met in the underground chapel, known only to a few. La Cripta di Pietro, a place lined with holy objects and warnings. The subject was not Mariamne by name. She was never mentioned directly. Instead, the phrase used in the records was the inscription of feminine voice. Luca paused at those words. It was like watching a truth placed inside a container, dressed in language, intended to obscure its power. The assembly's notes were brief, deliberate. They did not deny the engravings. They did not claim the chronicle was fake. They simply said, if made known, it will cause confusion in the succession. It presents not a contradiction, but a rival memory. A rival memory. The Church had always built its strength on consistency, one Christ, one foundation, one continuous line. But Mariamne's voice spoke not of lines, but of presence, not of chains, but of breath. She recalled a Christ who gave no titles, only questions, who asked not for thrones, but for attentive hearts. And for the assembly, that was enough. A short ruling followed. The document was labelled internally as Sub Rosa Petra. Beneath the rose of the rock it was. It recommended no public response, no official denial, only silence. The Vatican chose to hide the discovery beneath layers of paperwork and policy. The hidden space would remain unnamed, the scripture would not be newly interpreted, and the whole affair would be deliberately forgotten. Father Emilio never went back to Petra, and his successors, like Father Luca, were purposefully kept unaware that the High Council had ever convened about it. But now the imposed silence had been broken. The scripture was no longer a neglected inscription in a desolate cavern. It was a truth emerging from the rock, the very thing the Council had desperately tried to prevent. A voice separate from the established order was speaking again. The light of morning flowed down the sandstone cliffs of Petra like liquid gold. Quietly and with a sense of warmth, Father Luca moved along the curved path of a tight channel that ran behind the main chamber, guided only by gut feeling and the faint memory of a simple drawing in Father Emilio's old diary. The diary mentioned a secondary niche, sealed and unnoticed, where an unmatched carving had been found, a carving that was never discussed. He located it behind a flat stone slab marked with a plain cross, barely visible under a film of ancient dust and the passing of time. The stone shifted with a hollow resonance, revealing a low, narrow passage behind it, just wide enough for him to enter sideways. Inside, the silence was absolute, thick and profound, a stillness that seemed to wait for permission to breathe. And on the furthest wall, illuminated only by the soft blue glow filtering through a high fracture in the stone, was the carving. At first, Luca believed it was another image of the Madonna, a veiled woman seated on a royal chair surrounded by farm animals and birds. But as he looked closer, his breathing hitched. In her right hand, she clutched a long key, an exact duplicate of the one carved into the tombs of past popes in St. Peter's Basilica. In her left hand, she held an open book, not a closed one. On her head rested a crown, plain, yet undeniably papal. She was not a religious figure. She was not a mother figure. She was a pope, a woman. Luca stepped closer. There, etched above her in gentle, flowing Aramaic script, were the words by which she was known. Keeper of the breath. Her voice kept the light burning. No personal name was given, but the symbolic imagery said everything. The text pointed to a figure holding the spiritual keys, leading a congregation, wearing a crown, and displaying, above all else, that same serene expression seen in the other carvings of Mariamne. The Vatican had consistently refuted such narratives. The myth of Pope Joan, whispered about in secret and recorded in banned writings, had been dismissed as mere folklore, a medieval tale intended to cause scandal or confusion. But this was much older, far more ancient, and it was not written on fragile paper. It was embedded in enduring stone. Luca traced his fingers along the rim of the open book in the carving. The details were fine, deliberate, every line etched with profound respect. This was not the work of a nonconformist or an outlaw, but of someone honouring a sacred truth. He could feel the danger contained within this image, the direct challenge it represented. If the authority of the Church was built upon an unbroken succession of male leaders, then what did it signify if the rock said otherwise? What if the first spiritual leader had not passed the keys to Peter but to her? The space was quiet, but deep within his chest Luca could hear the echo of a voice. Not loud, not insistent, just constant, still speaking. In a small private library beneath the main apostolic archive, concealed behind two secured doors and a faded painting of the Apostle Paul, a collection of confidential memos lay sealed within a dense leather-bound folder. These were not records for public viewing. They were private thoughts, recorded by hand by members of a Vatican panel assembled in the late summer of 1924, 1 year after Father Emilio's translated scripture had been quietly returned to Rome, and just months following his unexpected passing in the desert. The file bore only a single identifier: Petra. Father Luca had reviewed countless classified papers during his time at the Vatican, but nothing compared to this. These notes did not utilize the cautious language of religious scholars. They were filled with something far more intense: fear. Page after page was covered with short comments in Latin and Italian, scrawled with intense urgency. But one phrase, repeated again and again in different handwritings, circled and emphasized: threat to the Petrine office. The meaning was unambiguous. This scripture, this so-called breath gospel, did not simply call tradition into question. It destabilized the core concept of Peter's authority. One particular entry, dated October of that same year, stated, "If released, these writings imply a special mission separate from the apostles. Worse, beyond Peter, the woman's voice claims no need for any line of succession. This is not a difference in belief. This is a complete removal of theological birthright." Luca settled back in the dimly lit room, absorbing the words. Removal of birthright. For nearly 2,000 years, the Catholic Church had rested on one single assertion: that Peter the Apostle had been chosen by Christ to lead his church, that every succeeding pope was the heir of Peter, and that the authority to forgive and condemn had passed through Peter's hands, continuously down to the present day. But Mariamne's scripture did not endorse that lineage. It disregarded it. In her account, Christ selected no position of power, no gatekeeper. He simply shared his spirit with all of them, and her presence, not Peter's, was remembered as the first to carry the spiritual fire. The alarm was subtle, but very real. Vatican staff were directed to cleanse all mentions of Petra from accessible documents. Scholars who inquired were rerouted. Their correspondence was never answered. A cardinal who had reportedly spoken favourably about the early female spiritual teachings was quietly removed from his position. A single private memo, unsigned but stamped with the seal of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, summarised the matter. Petra endangers the lineage. Petra must remain forgotten. Luca closed the folder and leaned forward, resting his head in his hand. He could perceive it now, the tremendous pressure that had weighed on the church like a massive stone for centuries. It was not a fear of false doctrine. It was a fear of memory, a memory that refused to conform, a memory that spoke with a female voice etched into the desert cliffs, still resonating across time. And for the first time, Luca considered, what if the foundation upon which the church was built had never belonged to Peter at all? The route that led Father Luca back to the treasury was narrow and still, deeply carved between Petra's sandstone walls. Visitors had left for the evening, and only the gentle evening breeze stirred through the canyon. Shadows stretched long across the reddish rock, and the ruins seemed to murmur with their own history. But tonight, Luca was not returning to admire the ancient pillars or to read the scripture again. He had come following something he could not quite name, an intuition, a powerful urge, almost like a silent voice. It had begun the night he discovered the carving of the crowned woman. A small annotation slipped into Father Emilio's final pages mentioned the paired pillars and the path that does not ascend but descends. He had walked past the treasury many times before, but he had never paused to look between the columns. Now, with the last of the golden sunlight fading across the facade, he approached slowly. The immense columns stood like motionless, silent guards. At first, nothing seemed out of place. But as Luca pressed his hand along the base of the third pillar, he felt it, a dividing line, a place where one stone met another, yet imperfectly. It was hidden from view unless the light struck it just right. He knelt and brushed away the accumulated sand, revealing a worn inscription, barely discernible, a cross, but not the usual design. This cross had 4 equally long arms, each one ending in a tiny flared shape, a Templar cross. Luca's breath slowed. The Templars, who had vanished from written history in the early 1400s, dismantled by fear and political manoeuvrings. But whispers of their deepest secrets had never disappeared. Some believed they found holy artifacts beneath the Temple Mount. Others maintained they guarded forbidden knowledge. And now it appeared they had left their emblem here. He pressed lightly against the stone. At first, nothing happened. Then came a soft movement, like rocks sighing after a very long rest. A thin split appeared and a narrow opening revealed itself, just wide enough for a single man. He hesitated, then he stepped inside. The passage was low and cool, the air thick with the smell of old dust. But the walls displayed markings, symbols faintly carved in red. The flame, the fish, the open hand. He moved cautiously forward, and after a few paces the space widened into a small chamber. In its centre stood a stone altar, and carved into the front of it, just beneath the surface, was a familiar image. 7 pointed shapes surrounding a central flame. He moved closer, and something else caught his attention. Etched subtly beneath the symbol were 3 words, in Latin, Domus Verbi Sponsor, the house of the bride of the word. Luca stood motionless. The Vatican had feared Petra for centuries, but it was not only the scripture they had buried. It was a place of worship, one that had waited patiently, concealed between the pillars, for someone who remembered how to listen. The inner chamber was cold, even beneath Petra's sun-scorched cliffs. Father Luca proceeded cautiously through the dimly lit passage beyond the Templar altar, his fingertips grazing the wall where the stone felt unusually smooth. The small light he carried flickered against centuries of profound silence. At the tunnel's end, the rock curved inwards. It opened into a low-ceilinged vault, circular and tight, with a single raised block in its centre. Dust coated every surface like fine ash. On top of the block rested a wooden container, no bigger than a small jewellery box. Unlike the rest of the vault, it was untouched. Not a single spider web crossed its sides. It was carved from dark, fragrant cedar, secured with iron strips that had rusted slightly, and sealed not with a metal lock, but with an impression pressed into thick, dried wax. And in the very middle of the wax seal, something else was visible, a stain of blood. Luca leaned in closer, careful not to disturb it. The iron strips bore inscriptions, in both Latin and Aramaic, but what captivated him most were the symbols on the seal itself, a ring of stars, a woman's hand raised in blessing, and beneath it one simple word, Sancta. The Vatican had always been meticulous in its official recognitions of saints. Holy figures were catalogued, named, and linked to verified artifacts. But there was no name here. only the seal and the blood. He knelt next to the pedestal and opened his private notes. The words from Father Emilio's final letter came back to him clearer than ever before. There is a vault she guards, not with locks, but with offerings, and the seal is not only sacred, it is intensely personal. Luca had assumed this was a figure of speech, but here it was, tangible and waiting. The urge to open it pulled at him with an immense force. He reached out and held his hand suspended above the seal, but something deep inside him made him pause, not out of fear, but out of respect. What kind of narrative required blood to be sealed away? The chamber around him now felt heavier, the air more compressed, as if the walls were observing him. In official Vatican procedure, artifacts sealed with blood were considered the most sacred, typically bone fragments or cloth stained with the blood of a religious martyr. But this was different. This was not the blood of final sacrifice. It was the blood of a serious commitment. He moved back and sat on the floor, the container resting between them like a quiet witness. A concealed scripture carved in stone. A woman acknowledged in memory. A secret meeting, choosing permanent silence. And now this. A sealed vault bearing no specific name but that of holiness. Somewhere high above, Petra's wind howled through the canyons, but in the chamber there was only utter silence. Luca did not break the seal that night. He simply recorded what he had seen, closed his notebook, and softly uttered the word etched into the wax. Sancta. Because, somehow, even without physically touching it, he knew. Whoever she was, the Vatican had not been able to eliminate her. She had simply chosen to seal herself away. At first, it sounded just like the wind moving through the tight stone passages. Father Luca lay still on his small bed, eyes closed, exhausted but his mind fully alert. The small fire in the corner had turned to embers, and Petra's night air pressed against the walls of his shelter like a cool, gentle breath. Somewhere outside, a wild dog cried out into the desert darkness. Then silence returned, heavy and expectant. Then it came again. Not the wind. A voice, very low, just beyond his normal hearing, but perfectly distinct. Luca slowly sat up. His journal slipped from his chest, where he had fallen asleep while reading it. He did not reach for his lamp. Somehow he knew the voice would not come if there was a light. He stepped outside, letting the dry sand cling to his bare feet. The cliffs above him glowed subtly under the myriad stars, silent keepers of a long memory. He turned towards the treasury, now just a dark outline against the night. And then he heard her words, perfectly clear and gentle. "Do not search for the entrance. You are already inside." The voice did not echo. It seemed to originate from the very stone itself, like a breath held for centuries, finally released into the air. Luca moved closer to the carved rock face. The lines of Mariamne's scripture were faint in the darkness, but now so familiar. He had traced them so many times. They had become a part of him. And still she spoke. "You will not find him where you left him." He walks forward. The phrases were not from any text he had ever read. They were not part of the visible carvings on the wall. They were new, or perhaps they had always been there, hidden beneath the stone's silence. Back inside he wrote down everything, every sentence, every feeling. His hands shook slightly, not from any fear, but from something more profound, a certainty that he was no longer alone. When he asked his Bedouin companion Suleiman about it the following morning, the old man simply nodded. "The voice on the stone," he said, while pouring tea. "She appears to those who carry no defences." Luca did not ask if he meant weapons or doubts. That night the voice returned, and the night after, each time a little clearer, a little closer. She was not distant from him. She was right beside him. He did not build fortifications. He created connections. She remembered what the establishment had forgotten, how to truly listen. Each sentence felt like a key to an unseen truth, a vault not buried deep underground but held within the heart. Luca had spent years guarding the church's past, protecting it, documenting it. But this was not mere history. It was a living, breathing memory, and it did not belong locked in a document or sealed behind glass. It belonged in the human breath. That was the Vatican's real apprehension, he suddenly realised. Not that the carvings existed, but that they continued to communicate. And finally, someone was paying attention. The wind shifted across the red desert of Wadi Musa the morning the airplane arrived. It landed without any celebration or sound. There was no visible insignia, no official press release, no journalists present. The small plane touched down just after the sun rose at the secluded military airfield outside Metean, a location used mainly for supply drops and occasional government surveys. Yet the military guards on duty knew to step aside without a single word. The necessary authorizations had already been finalized, stamped in Rome, days before the flight even departed. Inside the small cabin sat 3 men, each wearing black formal attire unsuited for the intense desert heat. They spoke very little during the flight, but the man in the center held a sealed leather briefcase resting across his knees. He did not remove his gloves. He did not look out the window. He sat with his eyes closed, his lips moving in what could have been a quiet prayer or perhaps something else entirely. His designation, or at least the one he used officially, was Father Severus. However, within the walls of the Vatican, he was not registered among the ordinary clergy. He worked for a sector of the church that never gave public sermons, never published scholarly articles. His work existed within the realm of classified information. He answered to no bishop, no public office, only the central secretariat, and sometimes directly to the Pope. He had been to this region before. Years earlier, in the late 1980s, when initial rumours resurfaced of a scripture inscribed in stone. Severus had been sent to Jordan to interview a German archaeologist who claimed to have photographed strange symbols near Petra. The man disappeared within weeks. His personal journals, mailed to his university in Frankfurt, arrived with key pages cleanly removed. The church had closed the case without any further investigation. But this time was different. This time a Vatican archivist had become disobedient. And worse, his identity was known. Father Luca Moretti, a devoted man, a quiet man, perhaps too devoted, too quiet. The type of priest who had access to material he was never intended to find. The kind who could recall obscure ancient codes. The kind who would refuse to look away when the walls started to speak. As the car navigated the narrow pathways of Wadi Musa, local residents glanced out from doorways but remained silent. They recognised the presence of deep, authoritative silence when it passed by. By midday, Father Severus had arrived at the entrance to Petra. He stood at the opening of the Sick, the serpentine stone canyon leading into the ancient city, and waited as the sun climbed higher. Somewhere past the curve of red rock, Luca was already deep within the ruins. The Vatican had not come for a search. It had come to ensure silence. And the man they dispatched knew precisely what was at stake, because buried beneath stone and centuries was not just a historical account. It was a voice, and that voice had begun to communicate once more. The first time Luca saw him, it was just after sunset. He had returned to his small basic shelter near the treasury, with desert dust clinging to his religious habit and sweat tracing the back of his neck. The day had been long. Inside the high canyons, he had deciphered more of the hidden scripture. The verses continued to change in meaning the deeper he read them, but his thoughts ceased the moment he entered the lantern-lit glow of his tent, and saw a man waiting inside. He was tall, and still formally dressed, entirely in black, the robes hanging without a single crease. No light fully illuminated his face, only his hands, clasped calmly in front of him, covered in old leather gloves. No one had heard him enter. No security personnel had followed. Even Suleiman had vanished from the campsite without any warning. Luca said nothing. He instinctively knew who the man was before a single word was exchanged. "Father Moretti," the figure said softly, almost like an old acquaintance greeting someone after a significant period of time. "I believe it is necessary for us to converse." The voice was recognizable, but not from ordinary life. It was the sort of voice heard in rumors that circulated through Vatican hallways late at night when the senior priests forgot to lower their voices. The voice of a man who worked in secrecy, whose assignments were never written down, whose travel was never logged. "I was informed you had retired," Luca responded, hiding the sudden tension in his chest. "I did," the man replied, "but the term retirement is flexible." He stepped forward slightly now, allowing the light to reach his features. His skin was pale despite the desert heat, his eyes dark, calm, and steady. He did not appear physically exhausted, but he looked incomplete, as if he belonged to a different environment that had not fully relinquished its hold on him. "Father Severus," Luca said, confirming their mutual understanding. Severus nodded once. "What you have uncovered must be returned to secrecy." Luca folded his arms. "You saw the gospel. I saw sufficient evidence. You read it. I do not need to." Severus moved closer, and Luca could now make out the edge of an old religious necklace hanging from his sleeve. It was darkened not by age, but by its use, a symbol of promises belonging to no official public order. "There are stories," Severus said quietly, meant only as a constant reminder, "but there are others that awaken something." Luca did not move. "And this story?" he asked. "This one dismantles things." The words lingered between them like smoke. Severus offered no outright threats, no official commands, only a choice. Give back the copies, seal the chamber, terminate the investigation. Luca asked what the consequences would be if he refused. Severus offered the faintest hint of a smile. "The Church will make no statement," he said, "and yet everything will disappear." Then, just as silently as he had appeared, the man in black robes turned and departed. No footsteps could be heard behind him, only the deep impact of a warning delivered in silence. And Luca, for the very first time, understood what the Vatican must have truly feared all along. That silence is not always an absence. Sometimes it is watching. It was late into the night when Father Severus returned. No noise announced his arrival. No breeze rustled the tent fabric. He was simply there, sitting once again opposite Luca, as if he had never left. This time there was no proposal, no specific demand, only silence, and then a slow, deliberate drawing of breath before he spoke. "You believe Petra is a place of finding," Severus stated. "But you are mistaken." Luca maintained his steady gaze. "Then what is it?" The older priest leaned in slightly. The small lamp cast a thin line of gold across his forehead. "It is a doctrine," Severus whispered. "One older than official meetings, older than ceremonial rings, carved not with written words but with light and stone." Luca offered no reply. "It does not try to gain followers," Severus continued. "It does not request devotion or submission. It does not require clergy or altars or confession. It offers no forgiveness, no feeling of shame." The words hung in the space between them like dust in still air. "Then what does it offer?" Luca asked. Severus paused. "Direct understanding, without intermediary, without hierarchy." And that was the source of the fear. Luca saw it now, as if the canyons themselves had whispered the secret. The Vatican had protected the sacred for centuries by keeping the divine at a careful distance, behind layers of ceremony and formal vestments. But this scripture, this carved voice in the stone, brought God too close. "If that is the reality," Luca said slowly, "then why keep it hidden?" Severus looked at him with something that resembled sadness. Because truth without structure descends into confusion, and confusion is more distracting than God. There was a profound weight in those words, not arrogance, not intimidation, but something ancient, as if Severus was speaking not only for the Church, but for a fundamental truth the Church was ultimately built to safeguard. Luca stood, but Severus remained seated. "There is no mention of Petra in the general archives," Severus said quietly. "No popular pilgrimage route, no formal religious commentary. It has been erased. Not destroyed, but intentionally buried." "Why not destroy it completely?" Luca asked. Severus met his eyes. "Because even the Vatican is cautious of stone. You can burn paper, silence a person, but stone retains memory." The quiet between them intensified. Somewhere outside, the wind swirled around the canyon walls, and in that instant, Luca grasped something essential. Severus was not merely an envoy. He was a guardian, not of official dogma, but of doubt. The kind of professional the Church trained not to believe or to challenge, but simply to contain. As the older man stood, he spoke one final warning. "If you choose to remain, you become a part of it. And once Petra remembers you, it never forgets." Then he departed, dissolving once more into the surrounding darkness. And Luca for the first time understood. This was not simply a secret the Vatican had concealed. It was a narrative too vibrant to be permanently silenced, a doctrine not recorded in volumes but in rock that still held life. It was in a dark recess of the Petra monastery that Luca found the letter, tucked beneath a loose rock, wrapped in old linen that was discoloured with age. The ink was faded, but the words still conveyed a sense of strong urgency. It was not addressed to a cardinal or a religious scholar, but to whoever finds this and still believes in spiritual energies that do not demand attention. The signature was weak, scrawled by a hand nearing its end. Father Matteo d'Angeli. Luca remembered the name. In 1954, Father Matteo had been briefly listed in the Vatican's official registry of exorcists, men trained not to heal the sick, but to confront hidden malevolent forces. But in 1956, his name disappeared entirely. No official reason, no death record, just profound silence, until now. By the light of his single lamp, Luca read the exorcist's final statement. "I was sent not to expel spirits," the letter began, "but to encounter one that had never been imprisoned." Father Matteo had been sent to Petra under a deliberately misleading mission. He had been told by Vatican authorities that an old religious site had once again attracted the attention of local Bedouin people who claimed to hear a voice at night, one that spoke in languages they had never learned. The Vatican had assumed it was local superstition, or worse, confusion, resulting from desert isolation. But the moment Father Matteo stepped into the stone chamber, he wrote, he felt something heavy press against his chest. Not evil, not aggressive, but immense. Too immense, like the lingering sound of a song sung long before the first grand cathedral was ever built from marble. In his letter, he confessed that Petra was not troubled in the way the Church defined it. There was no demonic force needing banishment, no scream of suffering, no thrashing of bodies or rattling of shackles. Instead, he encountered a silence so absolute it began to speak volumes. "The voice here," he wrote, "does not ask to be removed. It simply waits to be acknowledged." He remained in the city for only 3 days, and each night the carvings would communicate, not through audible sound, but through memory, as if the stone itself held deep thoughts, not just carved words. On the 3rd night, he dreamed of a woman walking the open desert barefoot, her arms lifted, not in formal prayer, but in open welcome. She knew the name before it was assigned, Matteo wrote. She was not a part of the Church, she came before it. When he returned to Rome, he told no one except a trusted colleague exorcist. That man, too, vanished within a year. And now, decades later, the truth had waited patiently beneath a stone until Luca found it. It was not religious defiance the Vatican feared. It was something far older, a spiritual presence too calm to be driven out, too sacred to be institutionally claimed. A presence that required no formal ritual, only stillness and a quiet faith that demanded nothing in return. The chamber was silent, save for the soft tapping of Father Luca's fingers against the stone surface. He sat cross-legged beneath the low arch of a carved doorway, his small lamp casting a gentle, flickering light before him. The scripture stretched across the wall in strange, flowing script. Neither common Aramaic nor Greek, but some old blend of both. He had successfully translated only small sections, but the accumulated pieces were beginning to form a picture that was unexpected and truly dangerous. This was not a familiar version of Matthew or Mark or Luke or John. This was something completely different. This scripture did not begin with a birth in a stable or a baptism in a river. It began with a faint communication, a voice in a garden, a woman standing next to an empty tomb, not crying, but speaking. And she was named not as a minor reference, not as a witness, but as the central voice of the entire narrative. Mariamne. She wrote not about stories with moral lessons, but about profound understanding, not about displays of power, but about true existence. In this scripture, Christ did not designate Peter as the foundation. He did not hand him the symbolic keys. Instead, he touched the ground and said, "The one who perceives shall carry the message." And Mariamne perceived. Luca's hands trembled as he translated the next line. I was there when he breathed his last breath, and I was there when he breathed once more. Not to give proof, but simply to remain. The scripture was not organized like a formal religious book. There were no numbered sections, no chapter breaks, no official instructions. It was rhythm, pure memory, almost like a beautiful song. And the more Luca read, the more he felt a strange internal shift within himself. Not a questioning of his beliefs, but a softening of their rigid boundaries. Could it be a fifth gospel? One the Church had never accepted, one it had perhaps long feared because it offered no need for a hierarchy, no claim of passing authority, only a shared spiritual connection passed from teacher to friend, from spirit to receptive soul. Outside, the stars continued their slow movement over Petra. The canyons murmured with the sound of the wind. Luca looked down at his small notebook where the translated words were slowly appearing in his own handwriting. He had begun copying the translation, not for Rome, not for the academics, but for the underlying truth, for the historical record, for silence finally being given a clear shape. This scripture did not contradict the others. It did not invalidate them, but it did something far more unsettling. It completed them, and that, he realized, was the actual source of the threat. The Vatican had not buried this gospel because it was fabricated. They had buried it because it contained the rest of the essential narrative, a voice they could never completely silence, a woman they could not successfully remove from the record. A fifth gospel, etched not on fragile scroll, but in stone that remembered every single word. Father Severus returned in the deep quiet of the night. His arrival was without signal. No shifting of the tent canvas betrayed his presence. He simply occupied the space once more, seated opposite Luca as if he had only paused. This time there was no prelude, no transaction sought, only stillness, broken by a slow preparatory intake of air before he began. "You believe Petra is a place of discovery," Severus stated, "but you have been misled." Luca held his eyes steady. "Then what is it?" The older priest inclined forward slightly. The lamplight drew a thin line of gold across his brow. "It is a doctrine," Severus breathed, "one that predates councils, older than papal rings, inscribed not in ink but in fire and rock. Luca offered no response. "It does not seek converts," Severus continued. "It does not demand devotion or obedience. It requires no priests, no altars, no confession. It offers neither release nor guilt." The words settled in the air like motes in a room without movement. "Then what does it offer?" Luca inquired. Severus paused. "Direct knowledge, without proxy, without hierarchy." And that was the core fear. Luca understood it now, as if the canyon walls themselves had revealed it. The Vatican had preserved mystery for ages by keeping the divine remote, layered behind ritual and vestment. But this gospel, this chiselled voice in the stone, pulled God too close. "If that is the truth," Luca said slowly, "why conceal it?" Severus regarded him with something akin to regret, because truth without structure descends into chaos, and chaos drowns out God. A gravity weighed on those words. Not pride, not threat, but something ancient, as though Severus spoke not just for the Church, but for a memory. The Church was designed to safeguard. Luca rose, but Severus remained seated. "There is no mention of Petra in the public records," Severus said quietly. "No pilgrim route, no theological study. It has been excised, not destroyed, but interred." "Why not obliterate it?" Luca asked. Severus met his gaze. "Because even the Vatican fears stone. You can burn paper, silence a voice, but stone retains memory." The quiet between them intensified. Somewhere outside, the wind coiled around the canyon sides, and in that instant, Luca grasped a realization. Severus was not merely an envoy. He was a guardian, not of dogma, but of doubt, the kind the Church trained men not to resolve or challenge, but to maintain. As the older man stood, he uttered a final warning. "If you remain, you merge with it, and once Petra recognizes you, it never forgets." Then he departed, melting back into the darkness, and Luca, for the first time, truly understood. This was more than a secret the Vatican had buried. It was a story too vital to perish, a doctrine written not in folios, but in rock that still held life. Luca had not anticipated finding the name of a knight in such a location. Petra was carved in primordial silence, long before the Vatican had even whispered the name of Rome, long before the Templar cross had ever been sewn in blood or thread. But within the margins of his translated gospel, a single line was scratched, not in the fluid hand of Mariamne, but in a sharper, blockier Latin. "Custodes ultimi sponsi, guardians of the final bride." The script felt familiar, medieval, Latinized, and beside it a symbol that arrested Luca. Where he sat, a red cross with a broadened base and rounded tips. It was unmistakable. The Templar seal. What was their purpose here? The Templars had sworn to protect sacred relics, objects of influence, of remembrance. But Petra had never appeared on any church map, not in Rome's official chronicles, nor in the routes for pilgrims. And yet here, in this gospel, carved into the living rock, the reverberation of their order pulsed like a heart buried beneath centuries of sand. Luca delved deeper. Back in the stillness of his temporary study, under a ceiling of stars and silence, he opened the one book he had carried from the Vatican's restricted shelves, a brittle codex known only by its internal name, Via Obscura, the Dark Path. It was composed in encoded Latin, a version only legible by those proficient in both faith and cipher. And in its final leaves, a strange diagram appeared, not of a church or city, but of Petra, or more precisely, a section hidden within its cliffs marked with the identical symbol found next to Mariamne's name. It seemed implausible, yet the consequence was evident. The Templars had found Petra. Not only that, they had known what was concealed in the stone, and perhaps more astonishingly, they had chosen not to dismantle it. Instead, they preserved it, defended it, hidden it away, not only from the world, but even from the Vatican itself. One sentence in the Codex stood out. She is not relic, she is memory, the bride, Mariamne. The voice the Templars, often depicted in stories as warriors or seekers of treasure, had transformed into something different here. Not soldiers, not even cloistered men, but witnesses. And in their secrecy, they had left behind no statues, no churches, no scrolls, only quiet marks cut in places few would think to look. Beneath the carved base of a statue, within the shadow of a column, between two slabs that met only when the sun struck the valley in a perfect line. Luca leaned back, his pulse drumming in his chest. The Vatican had feared the voice, but the Templars had listened to it and kept it alive. Their silence was not born of fear. It was allegiance to a gospel the Church could not embrace, and to a woman whose truth would eventually return. It started with impressions in the sand, not Luca's, and not Suleiman's. A second pair. He discovered them near the entrance of the canyon just before dawn. Subtle marks, partially effaced by the desert breeze. Whoever made them had crossed through in the night, moving without a lamp. That morning the air around Petra felt denser, as though the stones themselves were holding their breath. Luca said nothing to Suleiman, but that night, when he returned to his tent near the ruins of the monastery, he found the flap undone and one of his writing books missing. It was the brown one, the one that contained his first complete transcription of Mariamne's Gospel. He froze. He had not informed anyone in Rome of his destination. His departure from the Vatican had been quiet, with no goodbyes, no explanation, only a sealed envelope left on the desk of the archive prefect. But someone had trailed him, someone who knew what he had uncovered. Back in the settlement, the change was slight, but certain. A new person appeared in the tea shop where Suleiman purchased his bread. A man who never spoke, who always sat in the corner, always reading the same volume, though its pages never turned. The boy who carried water to the site ceased his visits. His father claimed he had been offered better employment. But when Luca passed by their dwelling, the windows were covered and the door was secured from within. Even the Bedouin guards who once protected the entrance to the high chamber grew cautious, their eyes flickering with anxiety. One evening, Luca returned from the tomb and found the prayer rug outside his tent soaked with oil. A warning. Not long after, he caught the flash of binoculars reflecting sunlight from the ridge above the pass. Then they vanished. The Vatican had always operated discreetly. Their watch was seldom loud, rarely visible, but it was never distant. Luca began sleeping in various locations each night, never twice in the same cave or ruin. He wrote less in his journals and started committing verses to memory instead. The gospel had to endure, even if he did not. Then came the final indication. Suleiman's youngest son arrived at Luca's camp, breathless with sand in his lashes. He delivered a crumpled piece of paper without uttering a sound, then disappeared down the rocks. On it, just 5 words written in Latin. They know you are alone. The desert surrounding Petra had once felt ancient and sacred. Now it felt observed. And for the first time since he arrived, Luca realized the gospel itself was not the only thing in jeopardy. He was being pursued, not by soldiers, but by silence, the kind only the Vatican could impose. The tap was gentle, but Luca heard it as if it had struck stone. It occurred just before the sun went down. The air was cooling, and the last angle of golden light touched the canyon walls like fire. Luca had selected this cave carefully, one that faced a narrow gully concealed beneath the route to the high place. Few were aware of its location. He rose from his mat, his pulse steady but his hands cold, and moved toward the opening. A dark shape stood against the diminishing light, tall, motionless. It was him, Father Severus. His robe was black, the same as before, the material still uncreased, still flawless. His face held no anger, only something worse. compassion. "You have been difficult to locate," Severus said calmly, stepping into the cave without waiting for permission. Luca remained silent. He simply moved aside, allowing the Vatican's shadow to enter. The quiet stretched between them, a veil neither wished to be the first to lift. Finally Severus broke it. "We cautioned you." Luca nodded slowly. "I recall. You have passed a boundary that cannot be retracted," Severus stated, his tone as level as a liturgy. "You are no longer an archivist, you are a threat." Luca met his gaze. "Truth cannot be dangerous." Severus tilted his head. "Only if it serves God. But this..." He glanced around at the cave walls, at the loose parchment rolled next to Luca's satchel. "This does not." "What is it you fear?" Luca asked, moving closer. "Is it that the gospel is real, or that it speaks without your consent?" Severus said nothing initially. Then he spoke with a voice as quiet as stone shifting in the dark. "The Church does not fear the truth. It fears the loss of structure. Without Peter, there is no lineage. Without the lineage, there is no authority. And without authority, there is only disorder." Luca allowed the silence to speak for him. Severus walked slowly to the mouth of the cave, as if weighing something he preferred not to articulate. "You can still depart," he said at last. "Return the gospel, surrender the copies. We will escort you back. You will suffer no harm." Luca studied him. "But it will vanish again." Severus's hands remained clasped behind his back, motionless as folded wings. "Some narratives are not meant for the world, but they are meant for the Church?" Luca asked softly. "No," Severus replied. "They are meant for the dust." He turned then, preparing to leave. But before he did, he looked over his shoulder once more. There will be no third visit. Then he dissolved into the descending gloom, leaving only the scent of frankincense and the sound of wind carving its way through the rocks. Luca stood alone, but he knew what had just transpired. The Church had delivered its message, and it had not come to listen. It had come to warn, and perhaps next time to suppress. The fire had long ago diminished to embers when Luca made his decision. He sat in silence for hours after Severus left the cave, his fingers tracing the scrolls and fragments of stone rubbings spread before him. The wind outside whispered through the canyon like a voice just beyond reach. He no longer questioned whether he was being watched. He knew he was. But it was not the eyes of the Vatican that troubled him most. It was the remembrance of what he had read, and the woman's voice he had started to perceive in the stillness between the words. Mariamne. Her name etched into stone with a devotion and clarity no canon had ever afforded her. She did not speak in threats or mandates. She spoke in invitation, in memory, in fire, and it was that voice that guided his hand now as he reached for a slim envelope hidden in the lining of his coat. Inside was a name he had not uttered aloud in years, a friend from his student days in Paris, now a professor of religious history with a particular interest in non-canonical texts. A man Luca had once entrusted with a secret more personal than any sin. He unrolled the parchment, selected the most undamaged verses, and copied them in careful ink. The candlelight shook with every breath, but his hand was steady. "He is not where you placed him," he wrote, translating slowly, for the breath of the living walks forward. Each line felt heavier than the one before, not just for its content, but for what it challenged. This gospel did not oppose Christ. It completed him. It did not reject Peter. It preceded him. And that alone, Luca knew, was sufficient to destabilize foundations. He folded the pages tightly and placed them in an oilskin packet and slid them into a narrow pocket on the inside of his satchel. At dawn, one of Suleiman's sons would ride to the village. From there, a trusted courier would take the letter to Ammon and from there to Europe. By the time the Vatican could react, the translation would already be in transit. It was not an act of defiance, It was an act of conviction. But Luca also understood what it meant by releasing that gospel into the world. He was no longer sheltered within the church's walls. He was stepping outside them, and once that boundary was crossed, there was no way back through the gate. He rose to his feet, the cave floor cold beneath his bare soles. He murmured a prayer, not one from any formal liturgy, but one he recalled from his mother, one about light finding places no one sees. Then he extinguished the candle. In the dark, he offered a faint smile. He had made his stand, and for the first time in years, he felt unburdened. The sky took on the colour of aged brass. At first, Luca thought it was merely an early dusk, as sometimes happens in the desert, where time yields itself to wind and silence. But this was different. The air did not cool, it grew dense. It pressed against his skin like a physical presence. And then came the sound, a low, resonating lament that rolled over the cliffs and through the narrow canyons, vibrating stones and stirring the dust. Suleiman emerged from behind the tent flap, his eyes narrowed, his expression inscrutable. He said nothing, only handed Luca a thick cloth and gestured toward the ridge. The storm arrived not in isolated blasts, but in a massive barrier, as if the horizon itself had decided to shift. Sand rose in huge coils, spiralling upward into the sky, obscuring the sun and coating everything in a sickly red haze. Petra vanished behind it, consumed entirely. Luca covered his mouth and moved toward the caves, but before he could reach the entrance, the ground beneath him gave a sudden tremor. Slight, almost unnoticeable, like a deep intake of breath just below the surface. Then the earth fractured, not widely, not dramatically, but enough for the sand to suddenly shift, at the base of a rock face. He stumbled, looked down, and saw a narrow depression forming, revealing what looked like the top of a circular stone boundary buried beneath centuries of wind-blown earth. He dropped to his knees. The perimeter of the circle was carved, not natural, smooth even, with a thin line of symbols running its circumference. The dust clung to the letters, but the design was unmistakable. A flame, a fish, a breath, repeating in an endless cycle. Luca's heart pounded. He reached out, brushing the sand away with shaking fingers. The symbols matched those in Mariamne's carved gospel. He had seen them before, faintly etched in the corners of the Petra chamber like silent punctuation marks. This was not simply a concealed ruin, it was a seal. He called for Suleiman, but his voice was swallowed by the wind. The sand hit his shoulders in waves, cutting his skin like tiny fragments. Still, he did not move. Instead, he placed his hand on the stone. It was cold, impossibly cold, as if untouched by the desert's heat. And then, faintly, from beneath the stone came the sound of water, not rushing or spilling, but dripping. Slow, steady, as if a chamber beneath was not empty, but sustained life. Behind him, the storm roared louder. The Vatican would eventually come for this, that much he knew. But for now, Petra had spoken, and it had chosen to speak to him. The desert storm, in attempting to bury the truth, had instead revealed it. The dust then settled in peculiar formations. By dawn, the storm had dissipated, leaving Petra quiet again, as if the wind had never screamed and the sand had not danced like fire in the sky. Luca returned to the location where the earth had opened. With Suleiman's aid, they cleared more of the debris. Each stone was moved with care, each breath measured. And then the circle revealed its complete form. At the centre of the pattern was a small indentation just wide enough for a hand. Luca pressed his fingers into it. For a moment nothing happened. Then the stone sighed. It did not break or fracture. It simply lowered, sinking into itself with a quiet hiss, like a breath being drawn by something sleeping beneath. A staircase appeared, narrow, winding downward into silence. No light reached beyond the fifth step. Luca ignited a torch. The traditional kind, oil-fed and steady, its flame flickering as he began his descent. The air was cool, ancient and bone-dry, older than anything you could remember. The narrow staircase twisted into a sudden, spacious dome. This was distinct from every underground room Lucas had previously encountered. This space felt deliberate, unmarred by either thieves or age, sculpted into the sheer rock face with a craftsman's precision. Its inner walls ascended gracefully into a high dome ceiling that was painted with delicate stars, circles, and winged shapes. These symbols pulsed with a faint glow whenever the torchlight swept across them. At the far edge of the vast chamber, a raised platform stood, and resting upon it was a carved stone basin. The basin was empty of liquid, but not vacant. At its very centre lay a small sculpted image. It was a face, eyes shut, the lips slightly parted. Circling it was a band of Greek letters, too fragile to have lasted through time, which contained a phrase that instantly made Lucas's breath catch. "Not in name, but in knowing, shall you be reborn." He had seen a fragment like this before, almost rubbed out in the margins of the gospel written upon the stone walls. But this was whole, intentional, as though the room itself was a living echo of that long-silenced voice. He moved closer. The air around the basin seemed to ripple. It wasn't a moving current, but a sense, a distinct presence. And then a sound arrived, so soft he nearly dismissed it as imagination. A single inhalation, not his own. Luca turned slowly. The chamber's walls, which had seemed smooth and plain, now glimmered with faint, etched lines. Hidden writings began to bleed from the stone, forming words as if roused by warmth. The words were Aramaic, Greek, and something far older. The torchlight flickered down for a moment, then flared back up. He was not truly alone in this room, not in the way a person is isolated in an empty space. It was a presence, not a person, and Luca understood in that instant that this place was not created for worship. It was built for recollection, not of religious law, but of something deeper, a truth that existed before language, something the Vatican had dreaded for centuries. He spoke to himself in a whisper just above a breath. They tried to bury it, but it breathes. The basin seemed to draw him in. Lucas stood before it, utterly still, the immense weight of passing centuries resting lightly on his chest. The chamber was a perfect circle, its floor gently sloped like a shallow bowl, guiding the eye toward the empty pool at the heart. The stone beneath his torchlight shimmered faintly, and around the basin's rim were words that raised the fine hairs on his arms. "Not in name, but in knowing shall you be reborn." The carving itself was unlike anything he had encountered, even in the most ancient church grounds. It was not fashioned for ritual grandeur. It was quiet, private, intimate. This pool was not intended for congregations. It was not meant for clergy or for altars. It simply was. It was made for something profound. Luca knelt next to the rim. His fingers traced the basin's edges, feeling the delicate tool marks left by a long, forgotten hand. At the bottom of the stone vessel, there was no cross, no lamb, no holy key. Only an inward-turning spiral, like a breath finding its way back home. A pool for baptism, perhaps, but not in the way the church would recognize it. He had studied the history of such ceremonies in the early centuries, long before the major creeds were drafted. Baptism had not always been a public spectacle. It had sometimes been performed in quiet, in secret, in river beds and caves, without a name being uttered. The spoken name was not the source of power. The internal knowing was. As he settled there, he noticed a tiny hairline fracture in the stone that ran along the edge of the basin. Luca leaned closer and saw that it guided toward a small, narrow channel cut into the stone floor. It was no accident, but a deliberate design. If water filled the pool, it would stream through that thin line toward another area, perhaps a hidden pathway beneath. He reached inside his satchel and withdrew the flask of water he always carried. not for any particular reason, merely a habit. It was holy water, blessed discreetly by an old friend before his expedition began. He poured it into the pool slowly. The water swirled through the spiral. Then it vanished, pulled away not by gravity, but as though drawn by an inhalation. A soft sound followed, a low hum, a vibration that seemed to emanate from deep underground. Luca froze. It felt as if the stone itself had woken up. The etchings on the chamber walls began to glow once more, not from the flame but in a strange rhythm. And he heard it. A voice, not spoken, but instantly present. The same words again, not in name, but in knowing. A form of baptism not only of water, but of truth, buried for too long beneath layers of dust and official doctrine. He sat back, his heart calm, not afraid. Whatever lay beyond the pool was simply waiting, not to be revered, not to be feared, only to be acknowledged. The moment Luca stepped past the spiraled pool, he felt the air change. It wasn't warmer or cooler, but simply altered. Like a breath held for too long, finally let go. A narrow tunnel opened behind the pool, low and rounded, like the throat of some ancient creature. And carved into the passageway's walls, illuminated by the dim golden light of his lamp, were hundreds of lines of text, not on parchment, not written in ink. It was stone. The words curled like wisps of smoke, not in straight, orderly lines, but in gentle waves and spirals, etched precisely yet vibrant with motion. They were not Latin, not fully Greek, and yet to Luca they spoke somewhere between Aramaic and something even older. Older than speech, perhaps. He had devoted decades to studying ancient languages, but this script, it was like hearing a melody he somehow already recognized. The breath. Gospel. That was the idea that came to him. Not a title found in books, but something he felt in his gut. The initial words, carved just above his eye level, read, "The breath is not the ending, but the returning." He whispered the phrase out loud, and the stone seemed to listen. The text continued. Not as a commandment, not as a law, but as a long narrative. It was a woman's voice. Mariamne, again. Her words were not shouts from high mountains, but quiet, intimate things. She spoke of a pilgrimage not meant to find the divine, but to remember it, to come back to it. The breath, she wrote, was the first gift and the last. Given before a name was spoken and taken before the burial. There were no threats, no punishments, no rigid constraints of belief. Instead, a quiet invitation. You will not know him by miracles. You will not find him in large temples. You will know him when you no longer search for him. Lucas remained completely still for a prolonged moment. The Vatican had trained him to study error, to diagnose theological deviation like a scholar identifies disease. But this was not poison, it was tranquility, and that, surprisingly, was the danger, because it made perfect sense, too much sense, a gospel that eliminated the need for a priest, a ritual, an intercessor. Only breath, only stillness, and knowing. He continued reading. Let no man speak on your behalf. Let no voice stand between you and the wind. The truth walks alongside you, not above you. This gospel was older than fear, and that was the Vatican's greatest dread. Not outright blasphemy, not rebellion, but simplicity, a truth too essentially human to be controlled. Luca closed his eyes. He could almost hear her, not as a mere echo, but as a presence. Not in the stone walls, but in the silence that settled between his own breaths. The breath gospel was not meant to be hidden. It had simply never needed to be uncovered because it was already within. It wasn't the etchings themselves that truly terrified the Vatican. It was what they made possible. As Luca sat alone in the chamber with the breath gospel spiralling along the stone surrounding him, He saw the truth not only in the words, but in what those words omitted. There were no altars, no requirement for a sermon, no hierarchy, no confession booth, no barrier between the sacred and the seeker. It was all right here, already here, the divine presence as breath, not as a rigid institution. He recalled the long marble corridors of Vatican City, how they echoed with countless centuries of ritual, tradition, and law. Thousands of priests moving in sombre processions, all believing that the Church was the one and only path between humanity and God. But Marimne's words offered a very different path, and it required no church at all. This was the Vatican's genuine fear, not heresy, but utter irrelevance. Luca remembered something a senior Jesuit had once shared with him during his early years in Rome, while they were reviewing forbidden documents deep beneath the apostolic library. Truth is not always the enemy, the man had said. Sometimes it is the mirror, and mirrors are far more dangerous. This gospel was a mirror. It didn't shout, it simply reflected, quietly, immovably. He placed his hand on the wall, running his fingers over the smooth cut of a line that read, "The path is not constructed, it is remembered." What would happen if this message reached the rest of the world? If followers stopped seeking answers through priests and started listening to what was already inside them? If breathing itself was prayer, if silence was the church? The Vatican could manage a scandal. It could conceal its secrets, manipulate historical records, even edit scripture. But it could not survive being entirely ignored. It could not survive becoming completely unnecessary. Luca now understood why the ancient transcripts called Petra the mouth of the stone. Heresy. It was more than just a place. It was a doorway, a different kind of church, carved not to dominate, but to offer a remembrance. He had been raised immersed in doctrine, educated in canon law, sworn to loyalty. But as he sat there among the soft shadows and profound silence, he felt no sense of betrayal, only peace. The kind of peace that did not require a single word to be understood. And for the first time, he no longer felt fear about the Vatican's reaction, because he had seen something they could not simply unsee, the divine without any architecture, the sacred without walls, and the breath, the simple, silent breath, was still with him even now, still potent enough to destabilize a city built on rock, and still potent enough to set it free. Of all the phrases Luca had read from the carvings in Petra, it was the very last one that refused to leave his mind. It lingered in his thoughts like a quiet song, half recalled, soft yet persistent, curling beneath his ribs even when he attempted to sleep. You will know him when you no longer ask for him. That was the final sentence of the breath gospel. No dramatic conclusion, no grand flourish. Just a simple truth carved so gently it nearly dissolved into the stone itself. But the full weight of it, the implications, were heavier than anything else he had discovered within those ancient walls. Luca sat at the chamber's edge, surrounded by symbols older than the church, by words spoken in silence and written as if in fire. He had translated every single verse of Mariamne's strange gospel. Some verses possessed a lyrical quality, others defied ordinary grammar, as though the language itself was shifting, breaking away from human structure. But this final line stopped him completely. It spoke not of condemnation, not of salvation. It was not concerned with sin or obedience. It required nothing from the reader, no donation, no confession, no pledge of loyalty. It was an absolute release. And that was the most profoundly dangerous thing of all. He thought of the Vatican, the sealed underground vaults, the hushed councils, the red folders stamped with the crest of the Holy See, all the overwhelming fear, all the imposed silence. Not because they feared blasphemy, but because this gospel offered no place for their established power to reside. Luca had grown up petitioning, praying, kneeling, hoping, always reaching for something external to himself. But this one sentence inverted all of that completely. It told him that the very action of seeking might be the thing preventing him from true understanding, that perhaps the divine was not a figure to be summoned, but an inherent presence that arrived when the search itself ceased. A knowing, not a desperate needing. He closed the small leather-bound journal in his lap. His personal notes now rested beside the old rubbings, fragments of rock, dust still adhering to the paper. He would transmit them discreetly to someone capable of keeping them safe. The Vatican would definitely arrive, he knew that, but they would be too late. The final word had already been set down, and once it was read, it could never be entirely erased. The desert landscape outside was calm. The wind had subsided. The night lay heavy across Petra, like a thick cloak. But in the silence, Luca felt something within him open up. It was not an audible sound. It was not even a thought. It was simply the total absence of reaching. He did not ask. And in that ultimate stillness, he finally understood. The sun had begun to ascend over Petra, softly colouring the rock cliffs in a light amber glow. In the complete hush before the morning fully arrived, Lucas stood alone at the edge of the high plateau, the stone warm beneath his sandals, the wind carrying nothing but quiet behind him. The chamber still contained the breath gospel, the carvings now faintly lit only by the early dawn light. The words were now entirely his to protect, and the gravity of that choice settled deep inside his chest. Below, near the curving track out of Wadi Musa, a white vehicle waited, the dust soft beneath its tyres, the driver motionless and patient. Inside sat Father Severus, his eyes obscured behind dark glasses, his hands resting calmly on a black folder. The communication had been clear: return with us or be permanently forgotten. Luca had offered no reply, not with words. Next to him now stood Suleiman, the old Bedouin hermit who had watched over this location longer than anyone else could claim. He remained silent, simply holding out a flask of cool water and nodding toward the eastern cliffs. "You cannot remain here long," the old man stated. "They do not tolerate stories that they cannot control." Luca accepted the water, the metal flask cool against his fingers. He had been offered a way to safety, a clean room back in Rome, a quiet, simple dismissal. His notes would be confiscated, sealed away in some obscured Vatican archive, permanently buried beneath layers of silence. But he had also been offered true sanctuary. Suleiman described a hidden valley 3 days to the east where ancient families lived without official names, and faith flowed like the desert wind, wordless, expansive, and sacred. There he could disappear entirely. There he could safeguard what the church genuinely feared. 2 possible routes, one of permanent silence, one of exile. As the light intensified, Luca pulled a page from his journal. Carefully, he wrote a single line at the bottom. "Let it be known not all Gospels were written for kings." He folded the page and tucked it securely into the binding of a second copy he had created by hand. That copy, bound in protective leather and stitched with deep red thread, would be carried by a trusted contact heading toward Oman. If anything should happen to him, the story would still endure. He turned to face Suleiman, his eyes calm but perfectly clear. "I will walk with you," he announced. The old man smiled gently, not out of simple joy but with complete understanding. "Then you are a pilgrim now, not of Rome, but of the breath." Together they began their descent down the narrow trail. The Vatican's emissary did not attempt to follow. He had no need to. Luca had already made his final choice. In the caves behind them, the stone gospel remained untouched, but in the heart of one man, no longer a priest, not yet a prophet, it was profoundly alive. And as the towering cliffs began to swallow his footsteps, the wind started to stir once more, carrying not audible words but a distinct presence, one that demanded absolutely nothing, yet offered everything. The letter was marked with a date, but the year itself had been smudged by time and human sweat. Only the words at the very top remained perfectly clear, written in precise Latin, as if each word had been carefully prayed over, to those who come after. Luca had waited until the complete darkness of night. The small lantern beside him flickered as the desert wind moved through the broken glass of the old monastery window. His hands, though held steady, carried a bone-deep weariness that precluded any possibility of sleep. What he was about to set down would be the final communication Rome would ever receive from him. He dipped his pen carefully into the inkwell and slowly exhaled. "I was once a devoted servant of the church," he began, "but the stone has taught me what the altar never could." The candle crackled softly. He proceeded to describe Petra as though he were speaking to someone who had never seen it. The reddish stone walls, the long, quiet passageways, the sculpted faces carved high into cliffs that seemed to watch even when no one was passing below. He spoke of the gospel, of Mariamne, of the breath, of the voice, and of the profound choice. Then, writing in a slightly smaller hand, he added something more vulnerable. "I do not know if this gospel is genuinely older than the four we currently acknowledge, but I do know that it is far freer. It speaks not in direct commandments, but in quiet whispers, not to dominate, but to awaken. There were no strong demands in the letter, no trace of bitterness. Only a quiet, sincere plea for those who might actually listen." He folded the piece of paper, sealed it carefully in wax, and placed it inside a plain wooden box, along with a smooth, small stone taken from the baptismal basin and a torn corner of parchment bearing the name Mariamne. The courier would depart precisely at dawn, a young travelling teacher from Lyon who had come to study desert languages. Luca had never revealed to him what the small box truly contained. He simply requested him to deliver it to a respected scholar in Paris, someone he had once trusted with crucial information. Outside, the stars had risen high. Before securely closing the lid, Luca added one final, critical line, written not in Latin, but in Aramaic, exactly as it was etched in Petra. "The breath returns to those who wait." He did not include a signature. The following morning the box was gone, transmitted discreetly through hands that never asked any unnecessary questions. Luca himself remained. He stayed in Petra, close to the hidden chamber where no one from the Vatican would ever venture again. He no longer kept track of time by bells or by calendar dates, but by the wind and the available light. And somewhere deep beneath the enduring stone the breath gospel patiently waited, no longer intentionally buried, merely resting. Years later, the original letter resurfaced during an auction in Belgium. The Vatican officially denied it had ever been received, but the scholar in Paris adamantly swore the handwriting was authentic, and the final lines still resonated strongly within him. "He is not here, for the Spirit walks forward." The intense storm had passed completely, leaving behind a silence that felt almost sacred. Petra's sheer cliffs were completely washed clean by the fierce wind and the relentless march of time. But now something crucial was missing. The intimate chamber that had once breathed, where stone carried scripture, could no longer be located by those who desperately sought it. Locals would later claim that the rock itself shifted, that sometime during the night after the courier had ridden west toward the border, the wind began to howl in a strange, concentrated circle, a sound like low chanting or singing heard through a veil. Then came the sand, blinding, scorching, contorting into shapes that no person could possibly follow. And by dawn, the chamber was utterly gone. The visible entrance had vanished. The carefully carved doorway that bore the words, "Speak only what is true now," opened onto a solid wall. As if the entire mountain had inhaled, as if the space had never even existed. Suleiman, the ancient Bedouin who silently guarded the cliffs, said he had seen a faint light moving behind the solid stone. Not a simple torchlight, something much colder. He walked the trail that morning with his prayer beads tightly wrapped around his hand. He understood completely what had occurred. She did not want to be found again, he whispered softly to the wind. The Vatican, for its part, offered no comment whatsoever. The envoy had departed days earlier. Father Severus was never seen again, nor was Father Luca. Some believed he had quietly returned to the monastery to live out his remaining days in contemplative silence. Others suggested he had walked deep into the massive desert and never once looked back. But the gospel, Mariamne's enduring voice carved in fire and stone, was gone, concealed not by time, but by conscious choice. That week, visitors in Wadi Musa commented on a strange, pervasive feeling in the narrow, winding gorge. A noticeable heaviness in the still air. Their footsteps became slow, their voices automatically softened. Some claimed they could hear breathing, like wind caught between colossal stone pillars. One small child claimed to see a woman with her eyes closed, standing exactly where no one had stood before. The local hotel owner asserted that the stone itself wept. That night in Rome, no public announcements were made, no letters were sent, no official acknowledgements. The apostolic archive remained absolutely sealed. And yet, behind quiet locked doors, there were persistent whispers, a faint disturbance like a breath drawn beneath layers of locked underground vaults. One archivist, a young man who had once carefully filed the name Luca Marini, discovered his access to records was mysteriously revoked. When he inquired why, the only official answer was that file no longer exists. He knew much better. Somewhere deep beneath Petra, the gospel continues to sleep, patiently waiting. Not permanently lost, but carefully hidden by a hand far greater than any earthly kingdom. Not truly destroyed, only deliberately sealed by those who believed its vital voice would inevitably rise again when the world was finally prepared to listen. And so it disappears once more, not into simple history but into profound mystery. It was raining the morning they buried Cardinal Bianchetti, not the heavy, violent rain that thunders against rooftops, but a gentle, steady mist that made the immense marble steps of St. Peter's Basilica gleam like polished bone. The square was nearly deserted, save for a small cluster of black umbrellas and deeply solemn faces. Cardinal Bianchetti had never been a man of public notoriety. His name rarely appeared in official public declarations, and his quiet voice was almost never heard beyond the immediate Vatican walls. Yet those who worked behind the scenes knew he was a true gatekeeper, a silent, powerful force within the ancient archives, a man who had observed too much and spoken far too little. His casket was simple cedarwood, with no ornate carvings or gold embellishments. But beneath the heavy lid, carefully sewn into the satin lining of his robes, the mortician discovered something that distinctly did not belong. A folded slip of parchment noticeably yellowed with age. The attending guards said absolutely nothing. The attending bishop whispered something unintelligible in Latin and quickly took the small letter, sliding it instantly into the folds of his coat. By the time the casket was carefully lowered into the crypt beneath the vast basilica, the letter was completely gone. Later that same afternoon, the bishop entered a locked room 3 levels below the Apostolic Palace. He handed the small note to a senior archivist whose hands trembled slightly as he unfolded it. It was unsigned, undated, but the precise handwriting was unmistakable. I was wrong to hold on to it, but I was not ready to let it be destroyed. The letter referenced only a single potent word: Petra. That night, a candle burned in the archivist's window long past midnight. He had faithfully served 30 years in the absolute heart of the Vatican, and honestly thought he had witnessed every single secret the Church could possibly harbour. But this information genuinely frightened him, because Bianchetti had been an integral part of a secret council that never officially appeared on paper, a tightly knit circle of 6 powerful men who met in silence and whose entire purpose was not to protect the truth, but to permanently bury it. They had not taken a formal vote. They had simply watched. And when Luca Marini's name was first whispered years ago, it had been Bianchetti himself who closed the entire file. At the funeral, a lone figure stood far from the small crowd in a long black coat with no visible collar. He watched the entire burial without speaking a single word. He carried no umbrella, even though the steady rain was dampening his shoulders. When the casket finally disappeared into the earth, he whispered something softly in a language no one present recognized. Then he turned and walked away through the mist. One nun standing nearby would later claim the man walked without making any audible sound at all. She remembered only his eyes, pale, deeply tired, and filled with a profound knowing she could not possibly name. When asked for his identity, no one could say. But in the days that followed, 2 additional names were discreetly removed from the Vatican registry. Men who had served on that same anonymous council, and one phrase began to be heard again in the quiet halls. The stone breathes still. She materialized just after dawn, when the weak light was still tentative and the deep canyons of Petra were exhaling the intense chill of the night. Luca had walked the narrow path alone, tracing the route faintly marked on the back of the small map he had carefully taken from the Archivum Secretum. His leather boots crunched over centuries of accumulated silence, and in the amber stillness he almost completely missed her presence. She was calmly seated at the base of a sharp rock face, directly beneath an outcrop shaped distinctly like a pair of folded wings. She wore no shoes. Her robes, though covered in fine dust, were brilliant white, a colour so intense that it made her stand out like a phantom against the rust-coloured stone. Luca instinctively slowed his pace, genuinely unsure whether she was real or merely imagined, but she turned her head slowly without a hint of fear, as though she had been waiting for him. "You're late," she stated quietly, in flawless Italian. He blinked hard. "Do I know you?" She offered a small smile, not warm, not cold, but deeply knowing, and her eyes were closed. "No, but I know the full story you carry." He lowered his heavy bag to the ground, still uncertain. In his chest, something tightened instantly. A quiet, deep recognition, like finally remembering a forgotten dream after years. She spoke again. "You came here to discover the breath, the gospel, the truth beneath the gospels, but it has no desire to be found. Not yet." Luca crouched low. Her skin was lined by sun and by time, but her voice had the unmistakable clarity of cool water drawn from a very deep well. She appeared ancient and ageless simultaneously, a woman who had simply outlasted all questions. "I read of you," Luca whispered, barely trusting the sound of his own voice. "They called you the Keeper." The woman gave a soft, dry laugh. "They called me many different things. Only one was ever true." He asked what that truth was, and for a long, silent moment she did not reply. Then finally she answered, "Witness." The wind stirred the fine dust around her feet. The shadows shifted on the wall directly behind her back, revealing the faint, subtle outline of something carved there long, long ago. A shape like a heavy key, a 7-lobed cross. Luca's breath hitched again. "Why is the Vatican so deeply afraid?" he asked. Her head tilted slightly to one side. "Because they know this place speaks of a Christ they never openly preached, one who walked not only with ordinary men but through the stone, the silence, and the breath." It made absolutely no logical sense, and yet every single word felt like a thread pulling painfully tight in his chest. Luca reached instinctively for his notebook, but when he looked up again, she was completely gone. No visible footprints, no trace of her robe. Only the distinct outline of the cross remained on the wall behind her, and in the dust where she had been seated, a single ancient phrase written in an ancient hand. He was not written. He was spoken. Inside a small, dim room at the edge of Wadi Musa, lit only by a tiny oil lamp and the faint morning light filtering through a shutter, Luca unfolded the parchment one final time. The fragment itself was no bigger than his palm, brittle like dried leaves and covered in a script that had not been actively seen in nearly 2,000 years. It had taken him 4 frustrating days to locate the only man who could possibly help, an elderly scholar named Father Gabriel ben Musa, a Jesuit who had vanished from Rome in the early 1970s. Rumours whispered that he had been officially exiled, not due to scandal, but for his translations. And here, in a forgotten corner of Jordan, he patiently waited without a church, without robes, and without a single word of complaint. "You truly realise what this is?" the old man asked as he carefully bent over the parchment, his eyes narrow and intensely sharp behind cracked spectacles. "I do not," Luca truthfully admitted, and that was absolutely accurate. Father Gabriel remained silent for a long, extended period. The silence grew so thin it nearly shattered. Then he began to read softly, translating the ancient text aloud. It was not Latin. It was far older than that, and not entirely Aramaic either, somewhere between Nabatean and something much stranger. The words once spoken seemed to resonate powerfully in the small room even after his voice ceased. He read of a voice, not the voice of God, but the voice that came before God, a deep presence that was never written down but genuinely lived in the breath between the actual words, a fundamental teaching that possessed no altar and required absolutely no temple. It spoke of something Petra was specifically built to remember, not to formally explain. And then Father Gabriel stopped entirely. He leaned heavily back in the creaking wooden chair, his face visibly pale. This was meant to be permanently lost. Luca leaned forward intently, the air suddenly thick. Then why write it down at all? The old man looked toward the shuttered window. Not all writing is intended for discovery. Some of it is left behind as a silent warning. Outside, a sudden gust of wind swept down the street. Dust whispered violently against the door like frantic fingers attempting to get inside. "There's more," Luca insisted. "There must be more." Father Gabriel hesitated for a long moment. Then, from beneath the loose stone floor tiles, he pulled out a securely sealed jar, its lid tightly wrapped in old wax, marked with the very same 7-lobed cross. This, he announced, was buried deep in the Vatican Library's card catalogue index, removed without any official name, intentionally hidden in the small footnotes of silence. Luca stared intently at it. A part of him desperately wanted to rip it open then and there. Another part of him feared that doing so would cross an absolute point of no return. "The gospel," the old priest whispered softly, "was never meant to finish its journey in Rome. It began right here, in this stone, in silence, and now, finally, in breath." In that single moment, Luca finally understood. The Vatican had not buried these challenging truths to intentionally deceive. They had buried them entirely to survive. And survival, as always, carries a heavy cost. In the quiet, deep corridors beneath St. Peter's Basilica, long after the last of the tourists had departed, and the final bells had stopped their ringing, a secret meeting unfolded that would never be officially recorded in any Vatican archive. The walls of the small room were intensely thick, not just with layers of solid stone, but with centuries of deliberate silence. 3 powerful cardinals sat solemnly beneath a single flickering chandelier, each one visibly older than the next, draped in heavy robes that rustled softly with every slow breath they took. A single dark folder rested at the exact centre of the table, securely sealed in crimson wax, bearing the unmistakable papal crest. It had arrived unexpectedly earlier that morning in a secure diplomatic pouch from a man, personally hand-delivered by a priest whose name no one officially recognised and whose immediate return flight was never officially scheduled. The accompanying letter inside was extremely brief, but its contents were absolutely devastating. Luca's personal translation of the Breath Gospel had finally reached Rome, and though he had sent it with the best of intentions, it was certainly not received with any form of gratitude. Cardinal Bolano was the first to speak. His voice was rough from age, but surprisingly firm, like someone who had spent an entire lifetime meticulously weighing every single word. "It fundamentally undermines the entire structure," he declared. "This gospel does not outright deny Christ. It simply and quietly replaces the necessary need for the Church." Cardinal Armenti, who had previously been the prefect of the Apostolic Archive, leaned forward slowly. "It does not replace the structure," he confided. "It simply eliminates the necessity for any sort of middleman between a mortal and the divine." That was arguably the most profoundly disturbing notion of all. The third Cardinal, Vincenzi, remained completely motionless. His eyes were still fixed upon the now broken seal. He had encountered these kinds of finds countless times, gospels that did not commence with the familiar words of Matthew, letters written by apostles the Church had never formally sanctioned, and divine instruction carved into rock when the world was far younger. The Vatican kept methods for neutralizing these threats, not out of malice, but from a genuine concern that humanity was not quite prepared for them. But what if the world had finally reached that point? What if someone else had already made that determination? The common people should be allowed to decide for themselves. "The Holy Father has been quietly informed," Bolano finally declared. "He will not speak of it. We will not speak of it. The translated scripture will not ever see the light. It will vanish, precisely as it was intended to." Amenti briefly glanced downward. "And what about the man?" There was an extended, silent pause. "Luca Moretti is not to be harmed," Vincenzi stated eventually, his voice very gentle. "He has committed no transgression. He only activated the switch. It is not his failing that we are deeply afraid of the light this reveals." Outside, a single bell tolled midnight in a confined chamber in Jordan. Luca was unaware that his discovery had already penetrated the innermost sanctuary of the Church. He did not know that 3 highly placed officials had just agreed to conceal a truth he felt the world deserved to finally comprehend. But deep within the ancient foundations of the Vatican, something had eternally shifted. The message had reached Rome, and even if no soul was allowed to vocalize it, its reverberation had already commenced. The air in Petra was absolutely still, as though the very cliffs were holding their collective breath. Luca stood completely alone beneath a sky that appeared untouched by the passing of 2 millennia. The last traces of the day's light had disappeared from the sculpted stone faces, and the silence embraced him like a heavy, soft cloak. All the urgency, the frantic messages, the translation effort, the persistent terror, it all felt distant now. He rested a hand lightly on the warm sandstone, tracing one of the deeply etched symbols, a spiral moving inward toward nothingness. This was the place. He understood it utterly now. Not simply an ancient location, but a voice patiently awaiting its proper turn. Petra did not loudly call out for recognition. It made no specific demands. It spoke softly, relentlessly, through the swirling dust, through the fractures in the rock, and through inherited dreams whispered during quiet devotion. Long before the Vatican constructed its marble structures, before the keys of St. Peter were handed from one pontiff to the next, someone here had inscribed a fundamentally different narrative, not on fragile paper but on enduring stone, a narrative that spoke not of earthly rule but of divine presence, not of rigid doctrine but of spiritual homecoming. Luca closed his eyes and listened intently. Not with his ears, but with an internal stillness. And then, for a brief moment, he imagined he heard her voice once more. The woman from the highest concealed cave, the one who never opened her eyes yet saw absolutely everything clearly. "You are carrying significantly more than just words," she had told him then. "You carry deep memory." He had not truly understood the import then, but he did now. It was not merely an artifact that had passed through him. It was an ancient current, like water flowing beneath the very bedrock, subtly reshaping the unseen world. Back in Rome, the Vatican had delivered their severe judgment in complete silence. But silence could not unshare what had already been exchanged. A deep secret transmitted between people who required no formal clearance to receive it. The inhabitants of Wadi Musa began conversing in very hushed tones. A solitary monk near Mount Nebo composed a meticulous letter to no one specific, leaving it permanently hidden within a stone wall. A woman in Madrid dreamt vividly of fire on rock and awoke sobbing uncontrollably. And somewhere deep within the vast archives, a young novice discovered a misfiled scroll written in a completely unrecognized script, ending with only 5 words: "He spoke, and the stone breathed." Time, Luca fully grasped, was not a straight track, but an ongoing cycle, and whispers, once truly released, travel not only ahead or behind, but everywhere simultaneously. He opened his notebook, not to inscribe something new, but to formally record something that was already a profound reality. He did not need to sign the document. The story had found its own unmistakable voice already. And as the stars gently sparkled over Petra, the stones appeared to subtly incline, listening one more time. Inside the apostolic archive, far beneath the ornate painted ceilings of Vatican City, the temperature never fluctuated. Not too chilly, not overly warm, the kind of absolute stillness that forces people to whisper even in solitude. Father Thomas moved deliberately along the narrow walkway. His hands, though aged, still executed movements with focused elegance. He had devoted over 40 decades to the archives, easily long enough to lose all count of the popes who had presided and passed on. But he never once forgot the significant documents, the fragile parchments, the unique, musty scent of ancient ink. And he clearly remembered the story, not the one formally found in the official chronicles, but the one that had slipped discreetly in between them. In the chilly winter of 1974, a package had mysteriously arrived under deeply irregular circumstances. No return address, no identifying mark. Just a simple box wrapped in tattered linen. Inside, tucked away among dust and fragile sheets, was a careful transcription in a specific handwriting Father Thomas had never before encountered. Its concise title was simply "The Gospel of the Breath." He read the entire thing through once, then immediately a second time. By the third careful reading, he began to realize it was unlike any established scripture. It was more subdued, distinctly more personal. It recounted a specific teacher who communicated not through spectacular public miracles, but through profound, heavy silence. A figure who strongly believed the human soul was not saved by strictly adhering to law, but fully awakened through mindful breathing, deep stillness, and the simple act of memory. He had shown it to absolutely no one, not even the prefect. Something about its nature felt completely forbidden, or perhaps merely incomplete. Years swiftly passed. The pages officially disappeared from record, logged as permanently misplaced. Unofficially, he always suspected they hadn't been lost, but had been intentionally removed. But tonight, something inside deeply moved him. A letter had just arrived, carefully folded into an envelope so thoroughly aged that the corners cracked and flaked. No return address was provided, just a single line written in faded ink. "You were the very first to listen." There was no signature at all. But, as he unfolded the note tucked securely inside, a small fragment of parchment instantly slipped into his hand. It was extremely worn, yet instantly recognizable. And then the exact specific phrase instantly resurfaced in his mind. He hadn't seen it in multiple decades, but it instantly rose up like a clear voice summoned from deep sleep. The stone remembers what the mouth forgets. His hands trembled faintly as he precisely placed the small scrap onto his wooden desk. He slowly surveyed the completely silent archive. Everything appeared to be exactly unchanged. The familiar quiet, the cool, unwavering atmosphere. But he knew, without a single doubt, that something momentous had profoundly shifted. The Vatican never once acknowledged the gospel of the breath. It had never been formally discussed or debated in council. But here, in this small, perfectly hidden room, the deep memory persisted. Not in the official ledgers, not even within the secure vaults, but entirely within him. He settled back deeply into his hard chair, gently refolded the brittle letter, and whispered, "I remember." And from somewhere far beyond the thick stone walls, or perhaps from deeply inside himself, a low, quiet, answering hush was clearly heard, as if the entire magnificent archive were inhaling fully. The sun had completely set a very long time ago behind the extensive sandstone massifs of Petra, casting vast, deep shadows across the spectacular city of stone, but the profound quiet that followed was not the still quiet of true peace. It was an attentive, listening silence. Severus stood entirely alone in the very tight passage where the carved facial expressions of ancient deities watched over the desert landscape. He carried a tiny lantern whose weak light wavered and flickered gently against the rough walls, which were deeply etched by centuries of ceaseless wind and passing time. He had returned to this specific location, not entirely because he willingly wanted to, but because he felt an undeniable, powerful summons. Not a literal voice, but a compelling, unavoidable presence. It had all begun the previous day, when the primary translator found a single specific line in the meticulously concealed manuscript that read, "He who sees the stone that sees clearly hears what was never spoken." Initially, it had seemed like merely one of the many perplexing poetic enigmas within the detailed breath gospel. But that single, concise line absolutely refused to leave his racing thoughts. He had rigorously followed the winding, complex trail into the deepest, narrowest section of Petra, the kind of secluded place that average tourists never even attempted to venture into. There, just beyond a tragically collapsed column, was a specific carving completely unlike any other. A single widely spaced eye, smoothed nearly perfectly by centuries of abrasive desert wind, and it was staring directly at him. He moved much closer. The eye was not beautiful in any sense. It was stark, simple, and unadorned. And yet, it stirred a profoundly uncomfortable feeling, as though it had not been carved for simple observation, but specifically for the act of true seeing. He deliberately reached out and touched the outer edge of the stone. It felt remarkably warm, significantly warmer than it should have been in the clear night air. Then came the unmistakable sound, a deep, measured, quiet breath. Not the simple wind, not a common echo, but a distinct breath, measured, absolutely deliberate, emanating from deep inside the rock itself. He stepped back very quickly. For a brief instant he vigorously attempted to convince himself it was only his tired imagination. But then the breath came once more, and this time it clearly carried a voice. Not in exact words he could immediately understand, but clearly in rhythm, like a language based not on specific letters, but on the relentless passage of time itself. Suddenly Severus distinctly recalled the old tale told by the elderly local monk in Wadi Musa, the one who spoke of a sentinel stone that actively guarded a deeply forgotten truth. The Vatican had quickly dismissed it all as mere folklore, a nonsensical narrative for simple pilgrims and known eccentrics. But this was clearly no mere tale. He turned sharply, fully prepared to flee in panic, but instantly froze when he saw what was positioned directly behind him. Another carving, identical in every way, a perfectly carved eye. But this one was entirely new. The fine dust all around it had not yet completely settled, and the intricate pattern clearly beneath it was unmistakable. 7 perfectly formed lobes, the exact precise shape taken from the forbidden gospel. He stumbled backward rapidly, his heart now hammering violently, not fundamentally from fear, but from a sudden, terrifying, powerful understanding. The stone was not merely a simple artifact, it was a completely new kind of communication device, a recording mechanism, and someone or something was actively still in the continuous process of inscribing. Back in the Vatican, they had been greatly afraid of mere symbols. They had been deeply afraid of apocryphal gospels and quiet, dangerous stories. But Severus was truly beginning to grasp the actual core source of their profound terror. The stone neither knowingly lied nor genuinely forgot. The small hidden chapel carved meticulously into the sheer cliffside was absolutely nowhere to be found on any existing map. No glossy tourist brochure ever mentioned it, and even the immediate local villagers in Wadi Musa referred to it only very indirectly, consistently calling it the chapel that watches. But to Severus, standing now at its partially broken entrance, it was significantly more than just a forgotten ancient structure of simple stone. It was a direct, irrefutable challenge to every single tenet he had ever pledged his solemn allegiance to. Inside, the heavy, unmoving air smelled intensely of fine dust and strong myrrh, a strange, distinct blend of the desert and ancient holy ceremonial rites. The extremely low arched entryway strongly forced him to duck deeply down, and as his strained eyes slowly accustomed themselves to the dim interior light, he saw what initially presented itself as a standard early Christian altar. But the chilling inscription meticulously carved directly above it brought him to an immediate dead stop. "Upon this rock truth shall not break, nor shall silence keep it." The meticulously chosen words hit him with the shocking force of a powerful physical blow, not because they were in any way unfamiliar, but because they bore a strikingly dangerous resemblance to a profoundly sacred verse that had once been loudly proclaimed inside St. Peter's Basilica. And yet here the inherent meaning was distinctly different, far bolder, as if it were an active accusation squarely directed at the established church rather than a staunch defence of it. He ran his entire hand across the coarse, uneven stone, precisely tracing the lines deeply etched into the wall. The flawless execution was clearly careful, absolutely deliberate, the painstaking work only of deeply committed people who fully comprehended the severe danger they squarely faced. There was a conspicuous symbol beneath the chilling text, a fish divided by a specific line, not horizontally across, but vertically straight down the middle. One exact half worn completely smooth, the other noticeably left rough, deliberately unfinished. A strange artistic choice indeed, or perhaps a clear, ominous warning. Severus sat very heavily on a rough stone bench positioned along the side wall, his tumultuous thoughts swirling completely uncontrollably. Back in Rome, he had taken a solemn binding oath to guard the tightly held secrets of the Vatican library, but nothing contained within that vast library had completely prepared him for this precise moment. He suddenly remembered an elderly, frail scholar he had once briefly assisted, a weary man with permanent, ink-stained fingers, who had quietly whispered late one night that Petra was not merely a ruin. It was a strong rebuttal, a quiet but firm argument directly against the Church's exclusive, entrenched claim to be the only true guardian of the complete sacred story. Severus had swiftly dismissed it all as the senile, delirious ramblings of a rapidly dying academic. But now, deep inside this expertly concealed chapel, the scholar's ominous words no longer seemed insane or dismissible. Behind the altar, a specific section of the wall panel was visibly ajar. He carefully stepped forward, gently prying it open with cautious, tentative fingers. Inside was a deep, significant hollow space, and in it, securely wrapped in dark, heavy cloth, lay a single book. Not a specific gospel, but a personal journal, written in a specific woman's distinct, recognizable handwriting. He immediately opened it to the very first page and read only one chilling, concise line before closing it instantly, profoundly shaken. If the church is built on the rock, then the rock must speak too. Outside, the wind suddenly significantly intensified. The sun was rapidly, quickly disappearing. Shadows swiftly climbed the stone, and in that perfectly quiet, still moment, Severus finally completely understood. The Vatican had been truly terrified of Petra, not fundamentally because of what it physically was, but profoundly because of what it inherently and completely remembered. The ground felt noticeably warm beneath Severus's worn hands as he meticulously brushed away the fine sand grain after exceptionally careful grain. The late afternoon sun was positioned very low, nearly entirely gone behind the towering cliffs, casting remarkably long, immense shadows across the numerous steps that led rapidly down into the newly revealed chamber. For many sustained hours, he and Miriam had intensely laboured in absolute, complete silence, their only company the wind's persistent, quiet whisper and the rhythmic, dry rasp of metal repeatedly striking against stone. This specific, completely hidden area of Petra had been completely inaccessible to the general public for many decades, not due to any conceivable physical hazard, but because of a persistently local, deeply unsettling mystery. Local guides carefully avoided it entirely, often calling it profoundly cursed, though absolutely none could clearly articulate the specific reason why. There were no discernible tombs here, no elaborate carvings of ancient gods or forgotten kings. Only a huge, entirely empty courtyard of deep red stone, cracked significantly and deeply by the relentless passage of long, unforgiving time. But something had dramatically changed after the very recent storm. Miriam had been the very first person to decisively notice it. A strange, distinctly hollow sound beneath her boots as she walked cautiously toward the exact centre of the courtyard. A resonant, flat thud, immediately followed by the clear sight of a sliver of stone that did not quite perfectly match its immediate surroundings. The heavy slab they now knelt closely beside had been deliberately placed, likely multiple centuries before, its exact edges flawlessly concealed beneath thick, deep layers of windblown dust. With one final, strenuous, combined effort, the large slab groaned audibly and abruptly broke completely free, exposing a narrow shaft of well-worn stairs that corkscrewed steeply and quickly downward. No engraved markers were visible. No identifying specific symbols, just the raw, earthy scent of completely dry earth, ancient and utterly undisturbed. They immediately exchanged a single, profound, wordless glance. "Do we seriously go in?" Miriam asked him, her voice barely a decipherable whisper. Severus noticeably hesitated for one very long moment. Every single professional instinct as a meticulous Vatican archivist instantly screamed for extreme, absolute caution. But deeper still, a completely different feeling powerfully stirred, a profound longing as if the unadulterated truth had been patiently waiting for precisely long enough. He nodded slowly and deliberately. The old stairs protested faintly and quietly under their combined weight, dust motes dancing rapidly and freely in the single shaft of thin light filtering down from above. At the bottom, the ambient air became noticeably colder, profoundly heavier. A solitary lantern from Miriam's pack just barely managed to push back the overwhelming, suffocating darkness, revealing exactly what lay below. A sturdy floor made of pure, solid stone was completely covered not with decorative tiles or elaborate carvings, but completely with words. Not painted, not lightly surface engraved, but visibly burned deeply into the surface. dozens of consecutive lines of strange, archaic script completely covered the ground, as if fire itself had been the specific tool actively used to write a potent message the world was strictly and deliberately forbidden to ever read. It was neither true Latin nor established Greek, yet distinct parts of it strongly echoed known gospel phrases, only noticeably distorted, clearly reversed, and meticulously rearranged. Severus instantly fell to his knees directly onto the stone. The Vatican held internal, hushed stories about a so-called gospel that was never truly committed to any parchment or vellum, one explicitly passed down not by human hands but by the deep earth itself. A fundamental teaching considered so absolutely dangerous that even daring to whisper its very name in the deepest corners of the archives could immediately result in instant reassignment, or even far worse. They had darkly called it the gospel beneath our feet. He specifically reached out and gently touched one of the clearly burned lines, and distinctly felt a noticeable warmth, even though the dense stone itself was cool to the direct touch. Miriam, too, immediately crouched next to him, gently running her very fingertips across a compelling phrase that roughly translated to, "The breath of God was not in the sky, but in the ground he shaped." Severus looked directly at her face. These significant words changed absolutely and irrevocably everything. Above them the wind suddenly began to howl loudly and violently again, as if fiercely warning them to immediately go away, or perhaps powerfully urging them to immediately continue, because the absolute truth was never truly lost completely. It had simply and deliberately been buried. The crucial letter was securely sealed with dark red brittle wax and conspicuously bore no visible name. It had been prominently waiting on Severus's wooden desk when he returned to the Vatican library that very precise morning. He immediately recognized the specific, unique style of the distinctive seal, used exclusively by the Order of the Scriptorium, a profoundly secretive internal group within the Vatican specifically tasked with monitoring, not preserving, that which should never be formally recorded. He instantly broke the hardened seal and carefully read the confidential contents in absolute, complete silence. A soft, quiet rustle of old parchment, the faint, lingering, dry smell of old smoke. One single, concise line. It has begun. His hands noticeably shook slightly, not specifically because he failed to accurately understand, but primarily because he understood it absolutely perfectly. In the very lowest level of the apostolic archives, concealed behind a sturdy wall expertly painted multiple centuries ago to convincingly appear like solid, natural stone, lay a private, restricted chamber known only to 5 specific individuals. Severus had only entered it exactly once, many years prior, when he first took his solemn, binding oath. The others had strongly and repeatedly warned him of exactly what was permanently kept inside. Not holy relics, not original scripture, but pure fear itself, written definitively down, specifically named and permanently sealed and concealed. There was a specific ancient secret name for it contained in the records, Pneuma Vetitum, the forbidden breath. It was a core, fundamental doctrine fundamentally older than the actual city of Rome, older even than the completely established canonical Gospels. It spoke clearly of a fundamental teaching that explicitly required no formal priests, no elaborate, magnificent churches, and absolutely no formal, strict rituals. A powerful teaching whispered intimately in the desert dust, permanently inscribed in enduring, solid stone, and carried solely by the passing, persistent wind. A gospel that boldly and fiercely asserted that divinity was not exclusive or rare, that every single person, man or woman, carried the very breath of the divine, not through religious formal ordination, but simply through the profound, simple act of being genuinely alive. To the earliest church leaders, that powerful, potent idea was pure, uncontainable fire, and so it had been brutally suppressed, completely cremated, entirely discredited, and forcefully reburied repeatedly. But it had never been entirely or definitively destroyed. Now, Severus instantly knew it had undeniably surfaced again. He quickly climbed the worn stone steps 2 at a time and entered the highly restricted congregation's chamber without any prior invitation. The elderly, revered cardinals turned sharply and quickly, startled not so much by his unannounced entrance but by the undeniable severe urgency deeply etched in his intensely focused eyes. "It is absolutely real," he said clearly. "The gospel beneath the ground, the potent teachings inscribed permanently in Petra, they perfectly match the forbidden ancient script." The ensuing silence was absolute, profoundly heavy. Cardinal Bellari, who had once been his devoted, close mentor, slowly and deliberately rose to his feet. That gospel was absolutely silenced for one vital, important reason. Severus did not once look away from him. And yet it speaks completely again. The others looked nervously and quickly between the two formidable men, completely unsure where to turn their gaze, caught firmly between deep personal loyalty to history and blind, unthinking loyalty to concentrated power. Bellari's expression instantly hardened and tightened. "You would deliberately dismantle the entire fundamental structure we have tirelessly and faithfully protected for 2,000 exact years. For what specific purpose? For mere insignificant words in stone?" Severus stepped forward decisively and firmly. "Not mere words. Truth." Bellari deliberately turned his back fully, walking slowly toward the grand, intricate stained glass window that offered a complete, panoramic view of St. Peter's Square. "The Vatican's single, oldest fear," he said quietly and intensely, "is not actually heresy. It is human freedom." Severus stood firmly in that room of profound, suffocating power and dense shadows, and knew with absolute certainty that a critical, unchangeable line had been definitively crossed. Whether they chose to formally permit it or not, the world was already undeniably in motion, and deeply buried truths inevitably find an ultimate way to the surface. The wind decisively changed direction that particular specific morning in the high deserts of Jordan. The sky completely over Wadi Musa took on a strange reddish-copper specific hue, as if something incredibly ancient and profound was stirring restlessly beneath the fine, deep sand. At the absolute base of a completely forgotten narrow canyon, the primary stone doorway, once sealed securely and tightly with ashen prayer, cracked violently wide open. No one was ever truly meant to discover it, but someone finally had. Amira stood directly before the threshold with fine dust clinging stubbornly and thickly to her boots and a worn, leather-bound journal pressed tightly and firmly against her chest. It was not just any commonplace journal. It was her grandfather's, a dedicated Vatican translator who had disappeared without a single trace in 1974. Every single page she had meticulously studied, intensely whispered of a single, all-important, crucial word, pneuma, the breath. Not the simple, biological breath of life as casually described in Genesis, but a much deeper, more fundamental breath. A powerful breath that forcefully awakens dormant ancient memory, not only within individual people, but profoundly within the deep land itself. She decisively stepped inside the opening. It was markedly and surprisingly colder than it should have been naturally. The incredibly smooth walls were entirely lined with jet-black stone that faintly shimmered. Then she clearly saw the meticulous carvings, not in Latin or Greek or Aramaic, but something far more archaic and primitive. A specific script that did not progress from left to precise, right, or top to absolute bottom, but spiraled distinctly outward from a single distinct central point at the exact centre of the immense wall. That central point visibly pulsed. She was not merely imagining the sight. In Rome, Cardinal Severus intensely stared down at a small, brittle parchment left conspicuously positioned on his chair. He had not seen a mirror in over 20 continuous years, not since she was a very small child, innocently playing amongst the archives while her grandfather worked intensely late on translations. Now the name clearly written on the letter was distinctly hers. No official title was provided, just her name and the specific, unique symbol of the breath gospel placed clearly beneath it. He understood its inherent meaning instantly and completely. The potent prophecy deeply hidden within the gospel, one that had been fiercely and endlessly debated and strongly suppressed for centuries, spoke only of a return, not of a specific person, but of a fundamental core understanding, a specific time when the sacred truth would no longer be confined and held within secured vaults, but would rise naturally and powerfully like the wind sweeping across a vast, empty desert. Amira precisely placed a small, polished mirror to the exact centre of the wall. The stone profoundly breathed. Not a literary device, not a simple spiritual vision. It physically exhaled. Behind her, the entire room faintly shivered, and loose dust lifted gently off the stone floor, as if visibly pulled upward by an unseen, incredibly powerful force. She did not instantly run away. She listened intently and closely, not with her specific ears, but entirely with her breath. There were absolutely no audible words, but something deep within her chest clearly echoed in a perfect, rhythmic, silent beat with the moving air around her. And in Rome, Severus immediately fell to his knees as the old, pale ink on an antique Vatican scroll suddenly turned bright red, a clear, definitive mark, a definitive, unambiguous sign. It had undeniably returned. The breath that once made the powerful church tremble was now fully and completely alive again. Not merely contained within a dusty, forgotten document, not permanently bound by a strict old ritual, but wholly alive within a young woman who possessed no formal title and absolutely no official permission, only absolute clear purpose. What the powerful church had so desperately and fiercely buried had not actually perished. It had patiently and quietly waited, and now it spoke, through silent, enduring stone, through the persistent desert wind, and through a woman's fundamental breath, uncontrolled, completely unclaimed, and utterly powerfully alive.